this Planning Commission meeting to order. It is 6:34 p.m. on June 22nd, 2020. I'd like to welcome everyone on the second longest day of the year, and it's absolutely gorgeous, and I thank you all for being here because it's hard to be inside right now. Introductions, any that anyone would like for me to make? I think we are all familiar with each other. Jennifer Hughes, our Director of Department of Transportation, Darcy Renhart, our staff liaison, and of course, Glen Hamburg, our senior planner for this evening, or victim. So let's move right into roll call, please. Commissioner Pasco.
Present, sorry.
Great. And Commissioner Phillips.
Present.
Commissioner Lopes. Nope, still can't hear her. Okay, Commissioner Murphy?
Here.
Great. Commissioner Pack?
Here.
Commissioner Peterson?
Here.
Commissioner Schroedel?
Here.
And Commissioner Wilson?
I'm present, and I would like to note that I appreciate Darcy's work with me on trying to get me onto the video portion of this. However, my modem crashed today, and I'm unable to follow her instructions, but hopefully next time I will.
Great. Well, we're so glad you're with us, Mike, very, very much. And I'm Tammy Stevens, so I do believe everyone is here this evening in some capacity or another. Now that our roll call is complete, Darcy, would you help me with any public comment, which will be an opportunity for any attendees to provide a comment or question on an item that is not currently on the agenda? Do we have any? No, Darcy?
Nope.
No. All right. Well, then I think we're going to move into our public hearing. I have a page and a half here, so everyone hang in there. The public hearing is now open for the consideration of ZDO 276, a legislative proposal to amend the Clackamas County Comprehensive Plan and Zoning and Development Ordinance. Clackamas County is abiding by social distancing requirements during the corona pandemic. So this public hearing will be conducted virtually using the Zoom platform. Panelists for today's hearing, which include members of the Planning Commission and county staff, have both audio and video capability. Audience members who have joined the meeting will have their mics muted unless they wish to testify, in which case they will be called upon to do so by the county staff moderator. Audience members' video will not be turned on at any time. Today's hearing is being recorded as required by law. The county will make every effort to post the recording on the county website as soon as possible. The Planning Commission is charged with making a recommendation on the application to the Board of County Commissioners. The record from this hearing will be forwarded to the board, which will make the final decision on this matter. The board will conduct another hearing on this application on August 5th, 2020 at 9:30 a.m. The hearing will be de novo, meaning that the hearing will be started anew and additional testimony may be offered. Tonight's hearing will not go beyond 10 p.m. If not concluded, it will be continued to a date and time certain. The hearing may be continued for other reasons as well. If an announcement of an additional hearing date and time is made tonight, it will be the only notice given of that additional hearing. The public hearing will be conducted as follows. 1, Planning and Zoning Division Staff Report. 2, entry into the record of any additional correspondence received. 3, technical information from other government agencies. 4, testimony by representatives of recognized community planning organizations or hamlets. Maximum length, 10 minutes per CPO or hamlet. 5, testimony by any other person, maximum length 3 minutes per speaker or more as determined by the chair. 6, closing of the public hearing. And 7, Planning Commission discussion and action. There is a designated time during the hearing when it will be open for testimony. The chair will make it clear when this is. If you want to provide testimony, you will utilize the raise hand feature in Zoom if it is available to you. If it is not available to you, an alternative will be provided. Attendees on PC and iPad, you have a raise hand button on the Zoom bar. That's either the top or bottom, depending on your device. When the moderator switches you over to provide testimony, your screen will look different for a moment. Primarily, you will see all participants' cameras, not just the one who is speaking. Staff will call upon you when it is time for you to provide testimony. For the record, please state your name and where you are from or who you are representing when you begin. Once you have provided your testimony, your mic will be muted and your screen will return to normal. The Planning and Zoning Division staff will now present the staff report. Glenn, I believe you're on.
Very good. Thank you, Chair Stevens. Checking one more time that everybody can hear me just fine. Great. First, I'm just going to share my screen again, and we did test it before, so it should work. Let's give it a try. All right. Can everybody see the first slide okay?
Yes.
Very good. Thank you. So as Chair Stevens noted, the item on the agenda for tonight is consideration of Ordinance ZDO 276. The title of this ordinance is Minor and Time-Sensitive Comprehensive Plan and Zoning and Development Ordinance Amendments for Fiscal Year 2020. Tonight, I'd like to just give a very short background of why we're here with this ordinance. Then I'm going to walk through what the proposal is, but really focus on 4 significant issues because there's a lot that we could get into, but there's 4 specifically that might be worthy of some discussion. And then finally, I will summarize what are the staff findings and the staff recommendation as outlined in the staff report. Spoiler alert, the staff report recommends adoption of the amendments in attachment A. But briefly, just how did we get here? Well, the adopted work program, the long-range planning work program, has on it this specific task. That is an ordinance to bring updates as necessary to the comprehensive plan and the zoning and development ordinance, the ZDO, that are necessary to comply with new state and federal mandates that have come up, to correct errors that are in the code, to do just sort of general cleanup, but also to make some changes that require only minimal staff analysis. The work program also asked that we consider a couple of specific issues as part of this project, and I'll mention those again here shortly. But the Planning Commission held 2 study sessions on this project. One was in December of last year, and one was in January. And it was at that study session that we first talked about all of these items that are proposed, and we got some direction from the Planning Commission as to what the nature of these amendments should look like. And so that's what we're here with today. The Board of County Commissioners also looked at these topics and gave some further recommendations for what's included in this packet. That was at a policy session of theirs in February. Behind the scenes, staff have had meetings with community representatives, specifically those of Oak Grove, to look at what are called the small scale manufacturing proposal that I'll talk about. We've also met with multiple industry representatives to discuss the small cell wireless provisions. So with all of the input from those 2 study sessions, from the policy sessions, from analyzing the state mandates that have come out from recent legislation and federal mandates, and then in talking with community representatives and industry representatives, we're here tonight with what are the specific proposed amendments to governing documents for land use. And all together, while there are hundreds of pages redlined out in attachment A, they can all sort of be summarized into 24 proposals. And I don't want to talk about each one in detail, but I've decided that we could just sort of mention them. I will note what are the significant issues that I'll go into further detail here shortly. And then if there are others that perhaps the Planning Commission would really like to focus on and have some discussion on, we can address those as well. The significant issues are those that are going to be in bold. Now, of the 24 proposed actions, Many of them are optional, and I've highlighted those here in green and on the upcoming slides. Those are provisions that the county could choose to adopt if we want to, but we don't have to. One of the actions is highlighted orange because it is, I'm calling it semi-optional. There are some provisions that are mandatory and some that are optional. But then finally, there are plenty of things that are just mandatory requirements of the county, and this ordinance would amend the zoning and development ordinance to be in line with those state mandates, or they're just cleanup provisions that don't have any substantive changes to existing policy. So proposed action number 1, which I again will get into detail here shortly, is to increase the noticing distance for certain land use actions in rural areas. There's a proposal to reduce the required minimum setbacks for commercial dog kennels in rural residential zones. There's a proposal to allow the manufacturing of goods that are retailed on site in certain commercial zones. Those are all significant issues that we'll get into here shortly. But also, as we talked about at study session a few months ago, there's a proposal to allow land divisions of property zoned EFU when necessary for the siting of approved utility facilities. There's a new allowance for equine therapy in ag, forest, and exclusive farm use zones subject to state requirements. There's a proposal to allow accessory dwellings for family forestry in ag, forest, and timber zones. You might recall from the study sessions some months ago that this was the opportunity for an accessory dwelling on properties with one of those zoning designations for housing of family members when there is a forestry operation on the subject property. Pursuant to the Planning Commission's recommendation on this topic, the proposal would require that the accessory dwelling be a manufactured home and use the same driveway as the existing primary dwelling. Recall also that the accessory dwelling has to be within 200 feet of the primary dwelling. And in order to qualify for this, the property has to be at least 80 acres in area. And staff have estimated that no more than 60 properties countywide could even qualify. There are some amendments that would be necessary to comply with mandates for renewable energy facilities in resource zones. There's a proposal to increase the opportunities for urban road frontage fee in lieu of. This was, if you recall, the discussion of allowing developers to, instead of actually constructing certain road frontage improvements in the Portland metro area that are required in conjunction with certain types of new development, under certain circumstances, developers can already pay a fee to the county, and then that fee is used to make pedestrian improvements inside the Portland metro area. The proposal here, to be clear, is to add 2 additional opportunities for which FELO can be paid instead of the improvements being constructed as recommended by representatives of the Transportation Engineering Division. Then there's a lot of mandates. There's a proposal to change the ex parte contact definitions to match those in state law. There's a proposal to adopt procedures for review of small wireless facilities and apply a couple of standards. So these are those small, relatively compact devices that would help to enable 5G internet deployment. And we discussed at the study sessions how the FCC mandates that we conduct our review of these facilities within certain timeframes called shot clocks. So the proposed amendments would establish procedures for review of proposed small wireless facilities that meet those shot clock mandates. But it would also require that these small wireless facilities be the same color of any portion of a building that they're attached to. And then, as also recommended by the Planning Commission, that they be not allowed on things like trees or shrubs or other things that are living. Then there's the items, actions 11, 12, and 13 would just be codifying certain state mandates that, in fact, we already follow. We would just be updating the code to match what we already do with regards to, for example, non-conforming marijuana production, forest template dwellings, or EFU replacement dwellings. There's a proposal to allow certain expansions of non-conforming secondary schools on farmland as required by the state, to expressly allow small-scale farm processing, to allow farm breweries in farm zones, to allow cideries in ag, forest, and the EFU districts, all as mandated by the state, as already allowed by the state, I should say. The proposal would repeal the owner occupancy requirement for accessory dwelling units and repeal the requirement that an accessory dwelling unit provide one off-street parking space. All this for ADUs that are inside urban growth boundaries. This is already mandated by the state, and so we're just cleaning up the code to be in line with it. However, the county also chooses to allow, without being mandated by the state, to allow ADUs in the Mountain Resort Recreational District up in the Mount Hood area. This proposal would, to be consistent with how we treat ADUs in urban growth boundaries, also remove the owner occupancy requirement for the MRR district. However, we would leave the off-street parking requirement for an ADU in this zone because, as we discussed in the study session, the nature of a lot of the streets up near Mount Hood are that they are often narrower or sometimes clogged with snow, so there's less opportunities for on-street parking. So the Planning Commission suggested that we keep this requirement for this zone as we're allowed to. The proposal would repeal the owner occupancy requirement for what are called accessory historic dwellings. These are the things that are similar to ADUs, but not quite the same. They're only allowed outside of urban growth boundaries. And we are proposing to repeal the owner occupancy requirement so that we're consistent with how we treat accessory dwelling units. The fourth significant issue that I'm looking to discuss in more detail tonight is the repeal of the county's marijuana retailing operating hours. More details on that here shortly. We would repeal all the provisions in the comprehensive plan and the ZDO related to the campus industrial district. That's the zoning district that we have no more property of in the county following a recent annexation by the city of Lake Oswego. And in fact, the county's comprehensive plan prohibits us from being able to apply this zone to any new properties in the future. So we might as well just remove it from everything. There's some general housekeeping amendments proposed. And I think that that's pretty detailed outline of that in attachment A with the summaries. So maybe I'll just jump into the four significant issues, and I could stop after each one and we could have some discussion if that seems to make the most sense to you, Chair Stevens.
Yes, that's a very good idea. Thanks, Glenn.
Yeah, so we'll start with the first one, which is that rural noticing topic. The question here is, should the noticing distance for certain land use actions in our rural areas be increased to half a mile as we propose in this ordinance? Now, this is a greater noticing increase than the Planning Commission had recommended. The Planning Commission had recommended that we propose increasing the noticing radius to a quarter mile for properties that currently have a 500-foot notice radius, and then a half mile for those properties that have a 750-foot notice radius right now. And this notice radius increase would only apply to public hearings and type 3 applications. We brought this proposal to the Board of County Commissioners at their work session in February, and they suggested that we go a little bit further, that we just make it a half mile for all of the cases, whether it's currently 500 feet or 750 feet. They also ask that we extend the noticing radius of certain type 2 applications, and I'll explain what that is. So this proposal would only affect these 11 rural zones or land use actions with a subject property in these 11 rural zones. and it would increase it to a half a mile. And it would be an increase for all type 3 applications and their public hearings. So these would be things like conditional use permits, major subdivisions, home occupation exceptions. It would also apply to all appeal hearings of all type 2 decisions. So that would include appeal hearings of even a regular home occupation, a temporary dwelling for care, or a agricultural processing application. If that decision were appealed, then the notice of the appeal hearing would go out to property owners within 1/2 mile of the subject property, but just the appeal hearings on all type 2s. However, the actual initial application and the planning director's decision, which come before those appeal hearings, would be noticed at that half mile radius for certain specific type 2 land use applications. Those are non-conforming uses and vested rights. The Board of County Commissioners felt that these particular land use application types tend to generate the most public interest. And also these are applications that the opinions of the neighborhood have the most impact on the outcome of the decision and are most relevant to the consideration of the approval criteria. There are other type 2 applications that we could extend the noticing radius for, conceivably, say for a temporary dwelling for care permit. But in those cases, what neighbors a half mile away might be able to say maybe have very little impact on what the outcome of the decision would be in that case. Not like with non-conforming uses and vested rights. It may be the case in these applications that neighbors a half mile away could have some really good input on the consideration of these application types. So this is what ZDO 276 proposes. The pros and cons of this. Well, on the one hand, doing this would, of course, increase public awareness of these application types, and specifically of those, again, that tend to generate the most public interest and where the public has the most opportunity for impact on the decision. This proposal is also less costly than increasing the notice radius of all type 2 applications, just these select few. On the other hand, doing this is going to cost maybe about $4,000 more per year to the Planning and Zoning Division. I'm putting a question mark there because we just don't really know. Based on prior year application counts and the cost of printing, the cost of the paper, the cost of the postage, all of that factored in, we might estimate that somewhere around $4,000 more per year. Now, there is an instance where, because this proposal would increase the notice radius of appeal hearings of type 2 decisions, but not all of the initial applications or planning director decisions on those applications, it creates a situation where somebody might have never heard of a project until they get a notice of an appeal hearing. So to the extent that that's a concern, that might be something to think about, but know that this policy would have that effect. There are, of course, other opportunities for the public to learn of proposed land use actions already. We looked at some in the study sessions, for example, the various online tools or through their CPO. So some pros and cons, and maybe I'll just leave it there on this topic and we could open it up for discussion. Or ask if there's any questions of the planning commissioners here on this topic.
Does anyone have any questions for Glenn?
I'm curious about this, where you wouldn't get the notice of the original, but you would on appeal. Can you give me any example?
Yeah, so under this proposal, a temporary dwelling for care permit would be noticed to just 500 feet if it's in one zone, or 750 feet if it's in the natural resource zones. We're proposing to increase it to a half mile, only if that decision is appealed. So the initial application might go out to property owners only within 500 feet. And then if somebody appeals it, notice of the appeal hearing would go out to property owners within a half a mile. So there might be property owners when it's appealed who get this notice that, hey, it's been appealed, but they have never seen word of the application or the planning director's decision before.
And will they still have substantial opportunity to comment in the appeal?
Yes, anybody can appeal a decision already.
But in the appeal procedures, the notice of the appeal, they will have the ability to make public comment as normal procedures. They won't
Yes.
be limited because they didn't participate in the initial hearing decision.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. The only downside that staff just wants to raise, and I don't even know that it's a significant downside, is just the fact that some people might get this letter and have no background to it. However, they can comment on it with all of the same rights as anybody else.
I'm curious.
Oh, go ahead, Tom.
I guess I'm just curious why you have two different standards for an issue.
Yeah, well, we costed out what it would be to increase the notice radius of all type 2 applications, including their application, the planning director's decision, and any hearing of an appeal. And when we ran those numbers, it was about $90,000 additional in costs to the planning and zoning division. So we thought, well, maybe we don't increase the notice radius of all type 2 applications, because some of them maybe just aren't that controversial or just more routine. Maybe, for example, just a temporary dwelling for care permit or a home occupation renewal. But maybe there are a couple of land use applications that really neighbors further than 500 feet or 750 feet really want to know about. And hence why we selected out those particular land use applications.
Glenn, is there a reason HR and MRR are not included in this?
They are not. For noticing, we sort of fold them in with the urban zones. Right now, they have a 300-foot noticing radius. So when we were tasked with this project, we were to look specifically at the rural areas. And while, of course, those are outside of an urban growth boundary, the HR and MRR districts, they're up in a kind of more urbanized area up in Mount Hood. And if we were to extend the noticing radius of some of those more urban or urban-like areas, we would have a significant more number of properties that we would be noticing. So we just sort of left out all urban or urban-like areas in this particular topic.
I have a couple of questions here. This is Mike Wilson. This distance, is that measured from the property line?
Yeah, it is practically computed using a GIS program that we select the subject property, all adjacent properties under common ownership, and then we just type in a buffer distance of however many feet, and the computer actually generates for us a list of all of the owners of property that are within the specified distance of the properties we selected. It's not based on a surveyed property line. It's based on the properties as identified in our GIS tools, which is functionally the tax accounts, the tax lots.
Okay, and what is a type 2 land use?
Yeah, the type 2 applications, that's a shorthand for land use actions that are processed according to these type 2 procedures. These are applications that the planning director or their staff makes the initial decision on, and then can be appealed to the county's hearings officer. Rather than, say, a type 3 decision that the initial decision is not made by staff, it's made by the county hearings officer or another body. Examples of type 2 applications are things like farm crop processing, temporary dwellings for care, design review, home occupations, non-conforming uses, and vested rights. Type 3s might be something that's more significant, especially from a community standpoint. They include things like conditional uses, major subdivisions, zone changes.
Have we had many citizens upset with things that were classified as type 2 and put in, or is this just a notice to them and they haven't responded? What's been the response from the citizens?
I would say that the most, that some of the interest that led to this topic being put on the program was a concern of land use decisions for farm crop processing and non-conforming uses. There have been some controversial non-conforming use alterations in the county, and neighbors who live more than 750 feet away may have felt like they ought to have been notified of the application. Same with farm crop processing. There has been concern that applications for marijuana processing or hemp processing on farmland weren't notified to neighbors far enough, given the size of rural properties. The farm crop processing land use application was not included in this public notice increase proposal because it's one of those things that it's just the same approval criteria, and what neighbors, it's things like the size of the property, the setbacks, the amount of crops that are processed having been grown on the same farm. If you can meet those sort of pretty straightforward criteria, the permit is approved. And whether a neighbor 500 feet away or half a mile away is concerned about it, their concerns wouldn't be able to impact the approval criteria because it would be the criteria being the minimum lot size, the setbacks, et cetera.
So what I'm hearing from you then is some of these notices that are going out, even though the citizenry objects to it, they're within the guidelines that we have already established, and so it's a waste of time.
Maybe bluntly, that citizens might be concerned about a project, but the project nonetheless meets the approval criteria. And whether we give them more property owners notice of it or not wouldn't materially impact our ability to evaluate, does the property meet the minimum lot size requirement, or does it meet the setback requirements? Because they're just not subjective.
So this is somewhat to just appease those folks that are objecting to something that's already approved, ready, meeting all the requirements. Is that what I'm hearing?
Not quite. This proposal does not propose to notify more property owners of those land use applications that are sort of more clear and objective standards, because more input on it wouldn't really help or hurt any particular case. This proposal does offer to extend the notice radius of other land use applications where property owners' ideas would impact it. For example, non-conforming use determinations. In non-conforming use determinations, for example, an application to alter, change, or expand a non-conforming use, we have to consider, well, would that alteration have additional adverse impacts on the surrounding neighborhood? That's the criterion. And notifying more property owners of an application for such an alteration would allow more people to weigh in on what they say would be the impacts to their property. So it would allow those additional property owners the opportunity for input and their input could actually, in those land use application types, influence the outcome.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Other questions for Glenn?
I have just a comment. I think, Glenn, that the expansion on what our recommendation was that the BCC recommended, I think in our deliberations, we were trying to balance the additional cost and burden on the planning department versus wanting to notify as many people that could impact the projects as possible. So I appreciate their expanding it. That's all.
Thank you.
I have a
Yep.
quick question. So, you know, you're talking about $4,000+ of potential budget impact increase. What is the total notification cost or budget that you have now, so that I can just get an idea of what relatively, how big is this increase? Is that, you know, 10% increase or 20% increase or 50% increase of what your current budget is? Do you have any idea of what that is?
I don't have those numbers off the top of my head, but when we were playing with some of the potential radius increases at, for example, if we increase the notice radius to 1,000 feet, if we increase it to a quarter mile or a half mile, we looked at numbers that ranged from a couple $1,000s more per year to as much as $90,000 per year. But how much we're spending on noticing just right at the moment, I don't know.
Okay.
I'll just jump in really quick. I was hesitant to raise any comments as opposed to questions, but one point of clarification I think I'll make is that I think this becomes particularly important in rural areas where there's not an active CPO, because that's the place where a lot of times these notices are going out to a very small number of people, and there's not an active CPO, and the word doesn't get out. And I am very appreciative of the county commissioner's decision to expand this. I think it makes a lot of sense personally. I think that the extra dollar amount is so small in comparison to the county's overall budget. And you know, I think this is a really good step toward being more inclusive and engaging more of the community in the work that we do. I think this is a really good idea.
I guess that's why I was asking, how big is that $4,000? I mean, if it's, you know, the original budget was $10,000 to begin with, and you're going to add another 40% to it, that could be significant. But if your budget is already like 40,000 and you're only adding 4,000 more, it's not that significant. So I think just in the, you know, the added benefit of expanding the public involvement and knowledge is the cost and benefit can be weighed if you have a better sense of not just the absolute number of how much it might be going up, but relativeness to what the existing budget is. So I agree with you, Brian, that, you know, what you're talking about. My guess is that you have a much larger budget and this isn't that huge of an increase is what I'm guessing.
I would be confident in saying that this is a fraction of what we currently spend on noticing.
And Glenn, I'd like to say something in relation to Commissioner Pasco's statement. Hoodland does not have a CPO, so things go on inside Hoodland residential area in the HR zone and MRR that most people don't know is happening. That's why I bring this up. There's large areas that are not covered by a CPO. And my neighborhood's not covered by a CPO, and there's 500 lots in it. So yeah, something could happen just outside this area and we wouldn't know it until it broke ground. So I would really like to consider MRR and HR also be included in this.
Yeah, I should note that a couple of things. One, the notice radius increase would apply to properties according to the zoning district of the subject property. And so in cases where there's a subject property zoned FF10, well, if there's a property that is zoned HR or MR are within a half a mile, it will get notice of that land use application. It will just not increase the notice radius of projects that are themselves in an HR or MRR district. And then I would just say that we don't know how much it could cost to increase the notice radius in these other more urban zoning districts, just because we didn't run the numbers, because the initial work program topic was on these rural areas. I would venture to guess, though, it could be, I mean, if you're talking going from 300 feet to a half mile in urban areas where the lots are much smaller and there's quite more number of property owners to be noticed in that distance, it could be significant.
Are there any other comments or questions from the commissioners? I think you're ready to go on to topic number 2, Glenn.
Yeah, topic number 2 is the kennel setbacks. And recall that a commercial kennel in these 4 rural residential zones, FF10, RA1, RA2, and RRFF5, require a conditional use permit to be approved by the county's hearings officer after a public hearing. And it's the conditional use permit that looks at things like what the impacts of the specific proposed kennel would be on the particular surrounding area, and how suitable is any particular property for that proposed kennel. Regardless of all of those factors, regardless of the unique characteristics of a property or where the property is located, the code currently requires that all aspects of the kennel be set back at least 200 feet from property lines. And we looked at in earlier study sessions how if we had a 50 by 50 foot kennel space with those existing 200-foot setback requirements, it effectively requires a property be about 4.65 acres. And the concern had been that this setback requirement is unduly restrictive and is preventing for other properties from being able to qualify for a commercial kennel when the particular kennel operation might not bother neighbors at all. So after some discussion, the Planning Commission recommended reducing the setback from 200 feet to 100 feet. And the Board of County Commissioners supported that as well. So on the one hand, by doing this, more properties may qualify for a commercial kennel in these rural areas. And that could lead to more business opportunities and more opportunities for people to have kennel services. And the Planning Commission discussed earlier how that seems like a particular need in the county. It would still require that all the conditional use permit criteria be met. So the kennel, regardless of the setbacks, would still need to not bother neighbors. The hearings officer, in considering approving the conditional use permit application, could apply greater setbacks than 100 feet, than 200 feet. The hearings officer could conceivably still apply whatever setbacks they thought necessary in order to mitigate adverse impacts to the neighborhood. 100-foot setback for this type of use, to the extent that it's useful in your consideration, is similar to what Washington and Multnomah counties require in similar zones. On the other hand, this reduction, while maybe leading to allowing more properties to qualify, we don't really know how many more properties would qualify under this change because there's simply too many variables that would have to be considered, not the least of which just the shape of the property. In our example before, we looked at a very square piece of property, and a reduction in the setback really allowed more of the property to be used for a kennel. That might not be the case if the property is shaped otherwise. Of course, if people want to use an existing structure that doesn't meet even the 100-foot setback requirement, or if the only buildable space on their property is still closer than 100 feet, it may not help them at all. So there's too many variables for us to decide to determine how many more properties this would help, but conceivably it would help some. And then just the point that there may be no more rationale to 100 feet than 200 feet, when regardless of the minimum setback requirement, you still need to meet the conditional use permit criteria. So I'll leave it there, and then I'll just answer some questions.
Go ahead, this is Mike Wilson here. What's the criteria for the hearing officer for his discretionary setback rules?
Well, the hearings officer could apply any sort of condition to the approval of the conditional use permit that are necessary to make sure that the use doesn't adversely impact the surrounding neighborhood. One of those conditions might be something like putting up a wall that shields the kennel from sight from neighbors, or the hearings officer, based on the particular case and the particular property and the particular neighbors around, might say, well, the code requires a minimum of 100 feet, and I'm going to require this particular kennel to be set back 150 feet. Maybe because this kennel is more visible to neighbors at that location and in other sites. So as necessary for the hearings officer to find that the operation would not adversely impact the surrounding neighborhood, they could increase the setback to anything greater than 100 feet, case by case.
Seems like, if I remember, there was a lot of concern about noise. Aren't there codes and requirements for noise abatement already in place, and wouldn't these apply already?
When staff looked into the county's noise ordinances and the various rules applying to the natural resource zones, it doesn't look like there's a regulation that could directly get at excessive noise caused by a commercial dog kennel in these zones. So noise is still a concern, and maybe setbacks come into play. Maybe in order to mitigate noise impacts, we do need some setback requirement.
I don't think 100 foot's going to affect much noise at all with a dog. I mean, you can hear those for a quarter of a mile, half a mile away.
The conditional use permit process would allow an applicant to demonstrate how they would make sure their particular kennel would not be noisy, even if at 100 feet. A kennel operator might say, for example, I'm going to have all of my dogs in a particular building that's entirely soundproof, and the only spaces where the dogs go outside is in an area that's further away. Under the existing rules, even if a building was entirely soundproof, and even if they only had a certain number of dogs that didn't create a whole lot of noise, it would still have to be 200 feet away.
Okay.
Glenn, Tammy Stevens here. Just a quick question. This being a conditional use and heard by the hearings officer, the notice would automatically be that 1/2 mile?
Correct.
Just want to make sure. Thank you.
Yep. And because it's a conditional use, it would be notice of the initial application and of the hearing. So property owners within a 1/2 mile would get notice at both occasions.
So this type of use is a type 2?
It's a type 3, and there will be a public hearing before any decision is made on it. So all neighbors within a 1/2 mile would have notice of the application and opportunity to attend the public hearing and raise concerns about how at this particular property, in this particular case, maybe 100 feet is still not enough. And the hearings officer could hear that, and if they agree, could place conditions on its approval accordingly, that it be set back even further.
Any information on how many permits have been requested for this type of operation?
There has been only one approved that we can find since, I believe, the 1980s. But that doesn't really tell us much as to, is the reason why people haven't been coming in for these because the setback requirement is too excessive? We don't know. We don't know what causes people to not make an application. We don't know if it's because the setback requirement's too excessive or something else. But in consideration of the work program, there were members of the public who testified that they felt that there were regulations were too restrictive on starting commercial kennels in these zones, principally the setback requirement, hence why it's put on the work program.
What are the requirements to be considered a kennel? Is it 10 dogs, 15 dogs, or how many?
I'm going to pull up the definition in the ZDO to be absolutely sure. But yeah, it's a certain number of dogs on site at once, and not just any dogs, it's adult dogs and the number of teeth, mature teeth that they have. If you give me one moment, I'll pull it up.
And this would be dogs not owned by the person that owns the property, or there would be, you know, folks that are have their dogs there that the owner doesn't, the owner of the property doesn't own, right?
The particular use that this would apply to is as follows. It would apply to a kennel, which is any lot or premises on which 4 or more dogs, more than 6 months of age or with permanent canine teeth, are kept for purposes other than a veterinary clinic. Now, we would not apply this to somebody that just has multiple dogs of their own as pets. We're talking for commercial purposes. But as long as it's not a veterinary clinic, and as long as we're talking 4 or more dogs that are more than 6 months of age or with permanent canine teeth, it would be called a commercial kennel and would be subject to the conditional use permit and minimum setback requirements.
So somebody that owned 15 dogs that were their own, this would not apply to?
Correct.
Okay.
Other comments or questions from the commission?
I'll jump in, Tammy. And I'll just say that I'll put a plug in that I think that if there are people in the public who wish to testify on this, that would be really welcome. I continue to struggle with, you know, I think that it's clear that this this type of use and this business is really needed, particularly in rural communities. And I really struggle with this question of, obviously our goal is to balance that need with, you know, the protection of neighboring property owners. And I really struggle with, does that 100 feet actually add anything more than the conditional use process? Or does it just make it more difficult to locate these businesses in rural communities when they're really needed? I'm personally really still struggling with that question. And I think some input from the public would be really useful.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Anyone else? Okay. No other comments or questions? All right. Glenn, before we move on, let me ask the commission, we've been at this an hour, do we want to take a 5-minute break or do we want to wait until 8 o'clock?
I'm good for a break.
You're in support of a break, Mike?
I am.
Wonderful. Okay, let's take 5 minutes. It's 7:27 and we'll see you back here at 7:30 something. No. What is it? 5:30.
5 minutes.
Be back at 7:32. All right, we're at 7:33, so I believe we can commence with issue number 3, Glenn.
Very good. I will pull that up. All right, everybody can see that again just fine?
Mm-hmm.
Great.
Yes.
The next significant issue is about the manufacturing of edible or drinkable products that are also retailed on the same site, and also allowing related wholesale distribution of those manufactured and retailed items. The proposal is to allow this new land use in these specific zones: the community commercial zone, the general commercial zone, the corridor commercial zone, which is on sections of 82nd, office commercial, the rural tourist commercial zone, which is up in the Mount Hood area, and the station community mixed use district. And I've just put here on the screen some examples of where these zones are located. So we're looking at downtown Oak Grove, for example, along McLaughlin Boulevard, on the intersection of Sunnyside Road and 122nd, also on Fuller Road, just west of Highway 205, and then spots in Government Camp, Wemmy Welch's, and Rhododendron. These are commercial zones that right now, the code does not have any real pathway to allow for the manufacture of edible or drinkable products that are retailed on the site. So while you might be able to sell beer, you might be able to sell coffee or sell cheese or baked goods, you can't, at least that's the way the code is written, allowed to manufacture those goods on the same property. So this proposal would allow effectively things like brew pubs or a cidery, provided that there's also the retailing of those manufactured products on that site. Just to say some things about the pros and cons. Well, allowing this use would provide, again, more business and employment opportunities in the county. Any new development associated with this use, for example, putting up a new building, changing the arrangement of a parking lot, things like that, all of that new development would still be required to get design review approval from the county. So while you might be able to conduct the use outright, we're still going to be evaluating new developments, landscaping, parking, access, circulation, all those things. The proposal would increase the functional opportunities of a property, meaning that property owners would get to do more things with their property. And if you're a business owner, that might help you if you can come up with other ways to use the same property that you have. There's also been some strong community support for this, particularly from the Oak Grove area. They had advocated that this topic be put on the work program, specifically in the C2 zone. And they have, in the public comment period, expressed support for allowing this in the C3, that's the general commercial zone along McLaughlin as well. So they're in support of it. And other jurisdictions nearby allow similar types of land uses in otherwise commercial zones. So in one of our study sessions, for example, we talked about the small scale manufacturing that the city of Estacada allows in their downtown zone, and small scale manufacturing in Sandy that's allowed, and in Washington County, where there can be breweries making beer and wholesaling it offsite, provided that they are also selling it to customers retail on the same property. On the other hand, this use is going to produce some smells, some noise and traffic from trucks, for example. Staff finds that the traffic impacts are likely to be minimal for a few reasons. One, allowing this additional use, the manufacturing of products that are already retailed on the property, those two uses might occur at different times of day. For example, if there's a brew pub, they might be manufacturing the beer in earlier hours of the day, but not serving it to customers until the evenings. So the traffic impacts to and from the property from employees and from customers might be balanced out over the course of the day. Practically, there's just a limited number of properties that would qualify for this particular type of use. We're just not imagining it's going to explode into something everywhere that's going to create significant traffic impacts. I think it's worth noting, though, that even if we amend the code to allow this use, there's still going to be other barriers to the use being established. It's not going to mean that the use is going to happen all over the place, because again, there has to be vacant properties, there has to be that on-site retail sale, and there has to, if somebody wants to construct new development, have to be compliance with all of the design review criteria. So there's still other factors that would have to be met in order for the use to be exercised. That's all I'll say on this topic, though.
I have a comment, Glenn. I think this is good. Current issues with the shutdown we're presently under indicate to me that we're going to have some problems getting businesses restarted. And if we've got other folks that want to have increase their business, that's going to be good for our economy. My question, though, is there a percent of sales that have to be consumed on site included in this proposal?
No, there's not. We looked at other jurisdictions' rules for similar uses in similar zones, and they don't have such a requirement. I think it could be hard to enforce as well. We're not going to be able to track on an ongoing basis how much is being sold. And there might just not be enough of a concern that somebody would be manufacturing items that are not sufficiently retailed on site to prohibit the use, given the employment opportunities and all the other benefits of allowing the use.
Okay.
I have a question. Glenn, can you tell me why it's just the manufacturing of edible and drinkable products and not, say, like custom apparel, sewing, selling on-site, or bath and body, stuff like that? Why just edible and drinkable?
Yeah. For one, there may be opportunities in the code already to do the manufacturing of other items. For example, craft works, glass blowing, paintings, or other sort of craft or artistic items. That might be something that the code already allows, and so we don't need to allow that now. Also, when we met with community representatives in Oak Grove, this was their particular interest, was breweries, bakeries, and those sort of consumable products has always been the interest. And when we were discussing allowing the manufacturing of quote unquote consumable goods, the question got raised, well, what exactly makes something consumable? Does that make it something that's eaten, used in some other way? And since what everybody really sort of was looking at allowing was just things that are edible or drinkable, that's what we decided to propose. But we could allow conceivably the manufacture of other items, but things like bicycle repair or art studios, those are things that would already be allowed in these commercial zones.
Glenn, can you expand on that? Because initially you were using the word might be allowed, and then you said it was allowed. What are the restrictions, limitations on artistic and craft products being sold in this way?
Yeah, well, let me pull up in the code and see what the wording actually is. So in the urban commercial zones, the code would already allow something like an art studio. Well, a landowner might argue that their glass blowing operation is an art studio. And certainly the retail sales of that is already allowed. And if the blowing of glass counts as an art studio, it too is already allowed by the code. And I think that we would be generous in understanding that that specific currently allowed use in art studio would already allow something like glass making or the sale of artistic t-shirts or something like that, possibly. what the code just expressly prohibits is the manufacture of involving the processing of raw materials. And that's sort of the loophole that we need to close to allow things like a brew pub. But if the Planning Commission doesn't feel that the code is strong enough when it says something like an art studio is allowed, as including things like manufacture of artistic glass, we could include that in here expressly. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think it does. It is going through my head whether there might be a way to, for example, say an art studio and the manufacturing of products sold at that studio or something like that. It's not clear in my head yet how big of a restriction it is, but I echo, you know, these are obviously uses that I think we want to allow within the spirit of what we're doing here. And I'm just reluctant to, I just want to make sure that we're not cutting out some of those things unnecessarily. I don't have the answer yet though.
Yeah,
so,
maybe.
So are you saying, like, for an art studio, if that individual there that was running that operation decided to sell canvases that for the public to do their own painting or brushes or et cetera, stuff like that, that they were making on site, that would be included?
That's a good question. The specific use as it reads in the code is services, commercial, studios of the following types: art, craft, dance, music, and photography. And in our sort of internal discussions, we seem to agree that that would include something like a glass blower. But if you are a retailer who is making a business selling blank canvases, maybe the code doesn't allow you to manufacture blank canvases in the back. That might be something that you want to clearly allow. But then you might also want to think, well, are there certain types of manufacturing that we don't want to allow? Are there types of things that even if they're sold on site, we don't want to allow it to be manufactured and wholesale distributed there?
Glenn, may I ask, do we allow restaurants in this zoning?
Yeah, retailing is already permitted outright in these zones. So the retailing of all these goods is already allowed.
Well, you're manufacturing food in restaurants. Doesn't this fall into that classification?
It's always been a good question. And we've sort of agreed that, well, restaurant is an allowed use and every restaurant has a kitchen in it. So we've always said that, well, that doesn't include the making of food at a restaurant isn't manufacturing. The type of manufacturing that would be newly allowed is something that's not really a restaurant, but is you're making these products in larger scale and even indeed wholesaling on them off-site. And in the manufacturing right now is prohibited if it includes the processing of raw materials, things like hops or cider or something like that.
So is this going to be inspected by somebody for under health law?
This proposal wouldn't change any existing requirements that, you know, food handlers have under other agencies. I don't know fully what those requirements are.
Right, we're only looking at zoning.
Correct.
Okay.
Other questions or comments for Glenn? All right. Wow, I think we're up to issue number 4. Thank you, Glenn.
Sure. Issue number 4 is the one related to marijuana retailing operating hours. So the county's zoning code has a restriction for the hours that customers can be on site at an approved marijuana retailer and the hours that sales can be conducted. That limitation is 10 a.m. to 9 p.m. This is the only restriction on operating hours that the county has of any commercial activity in any commercial zone. The county does not regulate the operating hours of any other commercial business in a commercial zone. These restrictions exceed the state's current requirements for marijuana retailing. The state's OLCC currently restricts marijuana retailing to 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. So the effect of the proposed repeal of the county's restriction would be that marijuana retailers could be open 4 hours more per day under the state's current rules. And let me just jump to the next slide and mention what the pros and cons of this might be. Well, again, we're thinking about increased business opportunities potentially. If we allow a marijuana retailer to be open longer, they could potentially do more business if they chose to extend their hours to what the state would allow them. It also might provide some more customer convenience. It would allow customers, including medical marijuana customers, to go to a retailer at different hours of the day and be more convenient to them. We have heard from those in the industry that doing this would remove a sort of competitive disadvantage that marijuana retailers in the county have vis-a-vis retailers in nearby jurisdictions. Because in nearby jurisdictions like the city of Oregon City, marijuana retailers are allowed to be open longer. And then just as soon as you cross the city boundary, into unincorporated Clackamas County, those same businesses cannot be open as long. I mentioned that the ZDO doesn't limit any other businesses' operating hours when it's in a commercial zone. So we sort of treat this differently than anything else. Removing this operating hour restriction in the zoning code could provide retailers with some regulatory clarity. You know, they're going to be working 80% with the state's licensing program at OLCC and hearing that they can be open 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. And then they have to keep in mind that, oh, but the county says this about the hours. Just removing the overlapping restriction might provide some regulatory clarity to them. People have expressed that having increased hours of operation, as would be allowed under this proposal, could allow them to provide more security to their property under their belief that having customers on site for more hours of the day would be safer to their property, less chance of overnight break-ins, that kind of thing. And then finally, I don't know if there might be any social distancing benefits through this change or not, but it might be worth thinking about. For example, if we allow a marijuana retailer to be open for more hours of the day, and if they don't see much more or any more customers than they normally do, well, that same number of customers could be spread out over a wider period of time and less people on site at once, is one theory. On the other hand, there may be some downsides. And one of the downsides might be if we allow operators to be open longer than they are today, that might lead to more consumption of marijuana products. And people have concerns that increased consumption could have increased negative health impacts. The proposal is only to repeal the county's operating hours. It is not to set the operating hours specifically to 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. So by repealing the county's operating hours, we're sort of just leaving it up to the state to decide always what the operating hours are. So while the state says today that it's 7 a.m. to 10 p.m., they could conceivably at any time change those operating hours to what they like, and the county would just sort of go along with it. I mentioned social distancing benefits. There might be challenges. Maybe increasing the operating hours will bring more people and more bodies to a retail site than there were before. And maybe that has social distancing downsides. So maybe given the current situation of our universe, that's something to talk about. But those are what staff see as the pros and cons of this proposal. And I'll just ask if there's any questions.
I have a couple here. First off, I'm not an advocate of drug use or use of marijuana, so don't get me wrong about my comments here. I'm also an advocate of personal liberties. It would appear that if somebody wants to use marijuana and it's legal in our state, then they should be allowed to do that. And to restrict our retailers here in the county on their operation is inappropriate. Now, I'm curious as to what the tax opportunities for the county are with a positive tax opportunity here for increasing the hours here are.
Well, I am certainly not an expert on property taxes or any of the taxes that the county gets from marijuana retail sales, but it would be the case that if there is an increase in marijuana retail sales, that there would be more tax revenue associated with that. I doubt, but I am not at all certain that this change in operating hours would impact any property tax assessment rate, though.
But just the number of, the volume of sales would go up, I'm assuming, because we're adding, let me see here, 4 more hours to the opportunity to sell this product. So I would think that that would give, rather than going to some other jurisdiction that has longer hours, the folks that are closer to our retailers that are selling this product would avail themselves of that. You see my logic there?
I guess I'd like to add that, to me, why would we give our retailers a competitive disadvantage to other retailers in the region? Seems to me you want to have a level playing field for these guys. Essentially, our standards isn't creating a level playing field. So to me, I have no problem with repeal.
Glen, do you know if they allow 24-hour marijuana stores?
No, the OLCC currently limits all marijuana retailers in the state to sales only between 7 a.m. and 10 o'clock p.m. Of course, local jurisdictions can have even tighter hours than that, but not 24-hour sales.
Okay.
We have longer hours for alcohol sales.
Yes, we do.
No kidding.
No, I'm not kidding. I know.
And I just wanted to be doubly sure that it was clear, and I think it is clear, that this proposal wouldn't lead necessarily to any marijuana retailer being open for longer hours. It would just have the effect under the current OLCC rules of giving them the opportunity to be open longer if they want to.
Yeah, sounds fair.
Any other comments or questions for Glenn on issue number 4?
I was just going to make a comment that I was looking at. I've never looked at this information before, but to the extent that this product is legal, I was looking through it to see what other hours are in Washington and Multnomah County spaces, and they're all over the place. And I think, it's the marketplace that drives how many hours the certain businesses would stay open. I think it's appropriate to, adhere to what the state mandates are, but it's not necessarily. I mean, some of these pros and cons that you've identified, I just, when I was reading through it, it just felt like we were stretching a little bit to identify all the pros and cons. And I
try to make it interesting. That's why.
Yeah, definitely that. So yeah, I don't think, I have no real issues as to making it, adhering to the state regulations. And and making it, if there are any disadvantages, that you would remove that. But my guess is that the businesses are going to find their sweet spot as to when they're profitable to stay open longer or later. So
I think that's a good point, Carrie.
So I'll just pile on really quickly because Commissioner Wilson can't see me nodding my head in agreement. I agree with all of this. I don't think that there's any reason to treat this legal business any differently than anyone else in the state. And I appreciate your creative arguments, Glenn, but you know, I really do agree that we're putting our county businesses at a disadvantage, and this just doesn't make any more sense. It made, you know, there have been a lot of lessons learned since we originally created these regulations on marijuana, and I think it's time for us to move past this one.
Excellent. Any other comments or questions?
I have a whole bunch on not number 4. So when we're done with this item, I have a whole bunch of questions on the other.
I have a comment on number 4 here. What was the intent? Does anybody know what was the intent of the Board of County Commissioners to make our marijuana sales more restrictive than what the state was requiring?
I myself wasn't around for that, but maybe some of the others online might be able to speak to if they recall. But I seem to remember from our study sessions that there were voices at the time, maybe back in 2016, that raised this topic also.
I'll take a stab at that because I was there, and I think it can be summarized in that in 2016, this was all brand new to all of this. We didn't know what to expect, what was to come out of it. I think that there was an attempt to take a conservative approach. There was a group of people that were concerned, particularly about the safety impacts of these retail businesses that to my knowledge, have not played out. And you know, I think it was a response to an unknown. And I think that, you know, now is the time to roll that back because I think the fears just didn't play out.
Thank you.
I was around and I would agree with Brian's assessment.
Okay. Any other comments or questions for issue number 4? And Carrie, I agree with you. We have only really discussed 4 of the 24 issues. So at this time, are there any questions for staff from the commission regarding any of the other 20 proposed actions? And Carrie, do you want to lead us off?
I actually only had one question. I'm sure others who are more familiar with this would have more questions, but on the fee in lieu, I am a huge fan of fee in lieu. I think to the extent that we actually use that option to create you know, bigger benefit, I think is the right thing to do. But my question that I had is, how are the fee in lieu, the amount itself created, and as well as what kind of oversight does this county have in place to actually use the money to the intent that it was, original intent that it was developed or collected for, rather than actually replacing? Are we actually increasing the improvements that the original fee in lieu was intended for? So if you can address some of that, that would be really helpful for me.
Yeah. So the FELO, the fee in lieu of, is assessed by transportation engineering. And it's my understanding that they're going to look at engineers' cost estimates of what it would cost to, say, construct a required sidewalk. And then they need to pay that fee instead to county transportation engineering. And then that money goes into a pot and can only be spent per the code on transportation projects that are inside of the Portland metro area. because these fees are only being collected from the Portland metro area, and what specific projects the money is put towards is decided on through extensive process of deciding what are priority sections for sidewalk improvements or other pedestrian improvements. And it just goes into a pot that then goes to fund those decided on transportation priorities.
So 2 comments. One is when the developers put together the estimates for those projects, they're typically done with non-Davis-Bacon wage, Foley wage costs, which usually are significantly cheaper than the costs that are borne by public agencies who have to spend the extra, the Foley wages to actually build it. So what I have seen time and time again is you actually end up collecting less money, and then the linear footage or area unit of improvements that you end up with it, because the dollar goes to public agencies for actually create the contracts and whatnot. So I think it's really important how you estimate and what you end up collecting. That's going to end up with the like-for-like improvement that the county would see. So that would be one thing that, I would like to make sure that that gets addressed. And then the other thing that I've seen time and time again, so these improvement fees, fee and lieu, are basically improvement fees. The improvement fees get collected, and then they get used to replace the current deficiencies in the transportation system. So rather than increasing sidewalks or traffic capacity expansion projects or whatnot, you end up fixing the pavement, potholes, or some kind of maintenance related things. And I would very much like to make sure that the county has a way to provide appropriate oversight for the improvement fees to be used on improvement projects, and that you collect enough dollars that are actually going to result in actual improvements, rather than collecting 3/4 of what you actually end up spending. So, but I am a huge fan of fee and lieu, because I think collecting money into a bigger pot, you actually end up with the better projects in the long run, rather than doing things on a piecemeal basis. So,
Thank you.
I'd like to respond to the second part of what Commissioner Pack said. I can't respond to the whole question of the wage differential between public, and I don't know how that's being addressed by our engineering department. It's a great point, and we can certainly follow up and try to get you some information about that. With regard to improvements, the county has used the money for new sidewalks, and they have thus far tried to tie it to our Safe Routes to Schools program for the most part. So they built a new sidewalk on Torbank between River Road and the Oak Grove Elementary School. I'm going to forget this. I believe a project near Concord School, which is, I think was Concord, which is now going to be turned into potentially a park and community center. And then the third one I'm aware of is they completed a sidewalk section in the Sunnyside Village neo-traditional area where there was a key segment that was missing. So it has not been being used for repairs. So I can at least tell you that.
Let me jump in here on that. Besides being on the Planning Commission, I'm also on the Transportation Safety Commission for the county. And this issue has come up a couple of times. Safe routes to schools is a priority issue for many of us. And one of the things that I've seen is that when these monies are put aside by developers, they're put aside at a time, prior to when the sidewalks are built. And by the time the sidewalks are built, cost escalations have gone up, and they do not pay for the sidewalks in total. So it is a concern of mine that this money is going into a pot that some people think, and probably it could be true, that it is all going to go to putting these sidewalks in. I'm not so sure about that.
If I could just on that point, the amendment would allow Philo under the current rules to be paid in 2 additional circumstances when effectively the otherwise required frontage improvements wouldn't really serve any purpose, or when the frontage improvements themselves would present problems. So it might be that by allowing Philo to be paid in these instances, the county is getting more in terms of the improvement of its transportation network because it's not requiring a sidewalk to be built where it would otherwise be problematic. So for example, the amendments would allow Philo to be paid when the, say, required sidewalk would present storm drainage constraints. They could, instead of constructing that problematic sidewalk, instead pay the county a fee in lieu of it, and then the county could spend that money where a sidewalk actually makes sense. The amendments would also allow Philo to be paid when a subject property has 200 feet or less of street frontage, and the frontage improvements that they want to install wouldn't connect anything. So we're effectively allowing a developer to, instead of building a sidewalk to nowhere, to instead pay the county, and the county can put that money towards what is an established priority project. So the Philo option might help to ensure that we are getting sidewalk and other transportation improvements where they are actually needed, and not just built because the code requires it and it wouldn't connect to anything or would itself, you know, pose issues like storm drainage challenges.
So if I might, I'm just gonna play devil's advocate here a little bit, because I still have some real concerns around the equity piece of this, right? You know, and you could argue that, you know, we're forcing a developer to build a sidewalk to nowhere, but you're also saying that if, you know, if the sidewalk isn't there, development can happen, and then that community could never get that sidewalk. And in fact, that money might be used to build, you know, on the backs of a poorer community, to build sidewalks somewhere where, you know, it's perceived as more needed because of business, you know, or more equitable resources in another community. So, I mean, I just really continue to really struggle with this whole concept. I'm heartened that it's mostly being used for sidewalks to schools, because I think that helps with the equity component. But, you know, I just have this real fear that we're collecting money in one area to distribute it to anywhere else without any real clear guidelines around that, or what communities would benefit from it.
And I think that it only works if you actually have a program it's a comprehensive program it's aimed at addressing the needs. And I think that's why I bring up, you know, if you're not collecting enough because you're already starting from the short end, and if you're just putting money into places where, like Commissioner Pascoe mentioned, in areas that are not necessarily equitably being distributed, I think there is a huge opportunity for a misuse or places of islands of no sidewalk. I mean, 50 years from now, we may be ending up in the same discussion with, you know, other developments paying for areas that should have gotten sidewalks right now. But I do think if the transportation department actually had a program that uses the money to implement a comprehensive sidewalk program, Philo can be it could be a very good method to meet the ultimate objectives. And so
I have a question, not for Glenn to add to that. So when we're thinking about areas that don't have sidewalks now that may need them, one of the new criteria proposed by staff is the improvements are located on a road where a sidewalk or pathway does not exist within 200 feet of the required improvement. Why 200 feet? Why is that the magic number?
That was just the number that was suggested by the Transportation Engineering Division representatives who came up with these proposals.
Did they give you any reasoning why?
They thought that was a reasonable distance for which a sidewalk could be considered isolated or connected to nothing versus allowing a pedestrian to go that additional 200 feet without a sidewalk and get to a sidewalk that does exist.
Why are we limiting the sidewalks? Some of the comments that I've heard are that bicyclists want to have, kids riding their bicycles to school.
Yeah, good point. I should be clear that we're talking frontage improvements that are not just necessarily sidewalk requirements, but to the extent that the code requires something like a bike lane or any other sort of frontage improvements, this applies to all of that. But most typically we're talking about sidewalks.
So when this is used, is if it's meeting these criteria that we're discussing, the applicant can just elect to do it on their own, or is there some kind of approval with transportation that has to happen?
Good question, and I'm going to pull up the regulation to be sure.
While Glen's doing that, I'll just add that it is on the transportation planning program's to-do list, if you will, to establish a more, what's the word, robust, I guess, process for how they decide where to spend FILO. As I said, the projects heretofore have tended to be tied to the safe routes to schools, but they are looking at doing something more formal. So we can certainly share that with you as it moves forward.
Jennifer, do you know if this is used, or does this apply in any way, shape, or form outside the urban growth boundary?
No, it's only within. I mean, we don't require sidewalks in rural areas, first of all. So this was originally, in its earliest conception, really primarily about sidewalks. But as Glenn said, you are allowed to pay the FILO for the full frontage improvement, which can include certainly pavement widening and bike lanes and et cetera. But it was kind of tied to adding a requirement for an isolated single family dwelling to build a sidewalk, which a lot of cities have, but the county did not previously require that until this program was adopted. And I'm not going to remember the exact year, but it's probably been 10 or 15 years ago. So it kind of was a sidewalk program in the beginning.
And to answer Commissioner Phillips's question, as long as it meets one of the established situations, for example, that it is on a road where there are public storm drainage constraints, the developer can just elect to pay the fee instead of constructing it. That's it.
I mean, there would certainly be engineering department input on whether there really was a storm drainage problem. And I'm not going to know the specifics, but there was a particular application where this issue came up, where sidewalks were required, and it was going to pose a problem given off-site drainage facilities that we really couldn't require the developer to fix or build. And so it was a circumstance where the FILO would have been a good tool. And so I'm sure that's where this particular proposal came from. The other thing to realize is that these really are primarily infill development that we're talking about. We're not talking about somebody going in and doing a new 10-lot subdivision and building a new local street. In that case, they build the street with the sidewalk that's required. So we're talking about, potentially a 2-lot partition on a road that might not have another partition in the next 15 years. And so the idea that you would be able to aggregate all these little 100-foot or 200-foot chunks of sidewalks in some of our older neighborhoods that have very few sidewalks and end up with a developed sidewalk network that way, I think is unrealistic. And that was the reason that this program came about. It's like, let's pool all the money instead of having people put these improvements in, and then everybody thinks, why was all that investment made in a circumstance where it offers no value? We can pool the investments and we can build something that has community value, such as a sidewalk near a school that benefits potentially a lot of people. But certainly having a more specific program and looking at it through an equity lens, as Commissioner Pasco suggested, is important.
And I'll just put in, I think it's so important that I personally would request that we split this out, right? I totally get the arguments why FILOs are helpful and important, but I think we have an obligation to make sure that these funds are being spent in the right way and in an equitable way. And if we just kind of pass this and let let the administration generally work it out, I don't think we're really exercising the oversight responsibilities that we need to be doing. So I really think we should split this out as a separate question.
Very
I
good.
agree.
I agree also.
Yes, I agree.
Can I clarify what you mean? When you say split this out, meaning we're not going to act on this?
No, I'm just saying that when we vote on this whole proposal, at where we stand now, I'd like to vote on this particular item separately and really have a discussion about where we feel that this needs to go. And it may be we pass it with some other recommendations. Maybe we say it's not ready. I don't know yet, but I think this merits its own discussion separate from the rest of the proposal before us.
And the reason I say we need to talk about this separately is because I think there's too much discretion provided to the contractor that's building these sites.
Honestly, and my biggest fear is that the way it works now is these funds can be used anywhere, right? And there's no guarantee that they are used near the community. There's no guarantee that they're used for a set of things that the county has generally agreed on or equitable and have a clear purpose. You know, the reality is that these funds right now are being used wherever the politics drive projects to be put on the ground. And I'm not sure that's the right approach.
If I can add just one more element of this specific proposal, is it's proposing to increase it's proposing to increase the opportunities for which FELO can be paid to include 2 more opportunities, but it also is allowing FELO to be paid for frontage improvements regardless of the road classification category. And it also just makes consistent the requirements for the opportunities for FELO everywhere in the Portland metro area, regardless of whether any specific property is on an essential pedestrian network or elsewhere. It just makes the standards the same.
So, Terry Stevens, I have questions on 3 of the 24 items on the list. So I don't know when we want to go back to the other items and do the rest of the discussion when we get there.
Yes, that'd be fine. Go ahead.
Okay, so my first one is on number 6. Number 7 for the renewable energy facilities. Glenn, you said this was an update just to meet state law, but I had just a couple clarifying questions. Just want to make sure that everything that's allowed now is still going to be allowed with the change of who's reviewing it. And then I had a question on the actual existing code language. So if you have your code, it's page 401-37.
Very good, yeah.
It says, commercial utility facilities for the purpose of generating power for the public use by sale, but not including wind power or photovoltaic solar power generation. But the use table says that that's the one that applies to the PV and solar, so I'm confused.
Well, so the use table 401-11 should have 2 lines, and kind of right in the middle of the page, there's commercial utilities for the purpose of generating power for public use by sale, not including these specific uses, as they are specifically defined in statute. But then renewable energy facilities, which do include wind and photovoltaic solar power, are listed also as a conditional use 2 lines down.
In the use table?
On 401-11, the uses in the exclusive farm use district.
Okay.
And
so renewable energy facilities, it says subject to 401-05G4, which is the one I was quoting, saying not including wind power or photovoltaic solar power. even though those are renewable energy facilities that applies to.
I follow your question. I'm going to G4.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm almost there. I have to scroll on my phone.
You didn't get a packet like us?
Yeah, I see what you mean. I might need to cross-reference that and make sure that we're not disallowing something. I have to read through these red lines, but I think I see what your question is. It seems that we're saying that subject to something that doesn't allow it.
Yeah, that's what it reads to me. Or it's subject
Yeah.
to this, but then it excludes it where it's subject to, when it sounds like those are the only, conditions of operation that we're talking about.
Yeah, noted. I'll double check that. I have to
Okay.
scroll through to find it. Thank you.
So then my main question was that with these updates from state law is what's allowed now still going to be allowed, assuming that everything in the code ends up being clear.
Correct. And in summary, what will be, basically, there's nothing new that will be allowed. It's just now certain energy facilities will have to be reviewed at the county level versus at the state. But this is all mostly about something that is probably not going to happen in Clackamas County anyway, because the use in many senses requires that there be certain have like low value soils, for example, and be of a certain size. And there's just not really many properties in the county that would qualify. But just to be consistent with what state law says and provide in the code with what they could conceivably allow, this amendment is proposed.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out though.
So to be continued on you'll look into clarifying that code provision?
Yep.
Okay. I have questions on other sections, but I'll wait and see if other people have questions on this one.
Does anyone have questions on issue number 7, the energy facilities? Okay, go ahead, Commissioner Phillips.
Okay, I have a question on issue 10 in the staff report, the small wireless facilities, specifically about the design review standards that we were proposing. When we talked about...
What was that?
Which page are you on?
Oh.
In the staff report, page 6, I'm still finding where it is in the code. When we talked about the design review physical aesthetics for the small wireless facilities at our study session, we were kind of, at least the one I attended, I think I missed one of the study sessions. We were kind of spitballing it because we didn't really have any idea what these actual wireless facilities would look like, or the utility would look like. So I was wondering if there were any examples looked at our other work session that I missed. And then let me read my other question one sec.
I think we had some pictures that showed up at the study session.
Okay. And then I also saw that we got some public comment in regard to this one. So Glenn, when you enter those into the record, could you give an official, what staff's reaction to those public comments too?
Yeah, happy to. And I was curious if this would be a topic that is quote unquote a significant issue too, and maybe is worth some discussion. We did look at some pictures at an earlier study session of what these types of devices end up looking like when people do deploy them. And they are often these small compact boxes that are either attached to a building, they might be on a pole on a rooftop, but in almost all cases, at least so far, and as being mostly proposed by communications companies, is placing them on things that are inside public rights of way on, for example, existing utility poles, on traffic lights, on street lights, on bus stops. This proposal would have all small wireless facilities, as defined in the federal mandate, that are inside public rights-of-way, regulated not under the zoning code, but under the county's roadway standards. And one of the attachments is the new county roadway standards. This amendment... Yep.
Was that based on the FCC requirements, or just because that's how things are typically administered for in the right-of-way?
The FCC does not require us to regulate them either under the zoning code or roadway standards either. It just says that whatever the county's requirements are for these, whether they're in rights-of-way or private property, the county's regulations cannot exceed certain things. And the Transportation Engineering Division, who was updating the roadway standards, just took it under their wing to address the FCC's mandates as these devices are deployed in public rights-of-way. And then that leaves the zoning code to address them on private property. So for example, attached to a building or on a pole.
Glenn, the exhibit that we received, I forget who submitted it, suggested the language of exempting small wireless facilities, both for public rights of way and for county easements under the county's jurisdiction, right?
Correct.
And I was curious if that language was pulled into the staff proposal, and if so, what entails a county? In what circumstances would that actually impact?
The answer is yes. The zoning code says, to be fully clear, it would have small wireless facilities in public rights of way or in easements controlled by the county, regulated under the county's roadway standards. The zoning code would only regulate small wireless facilities that are outside of public rights of way or outside of county easements. I don't know when the county holds a roadway easement versus having right-of-way, but they're functionally similar things, just public access areas.
Yeah, that was
Glenn, are there any restrictions on these facilities being in a, let's say, a commercial building? Or hanging on a commercial facility, a building outside or above the building?
No, and just as Commissioner Phillips was asking, well, how does staff respond to some of the public comments about these? Well, there's two letters in the record. Both are from staff, from representatives that staff met with in the preparation of these, and they offer two suggestions on the proposed amendments. One of them suggests that we exempt small wireless facilities from any setback requirements on private property. So they're saying that we should allow these small wireless facilities to be right up against the property line if AT&T wants to. Staff would want to remind, though, that the small wireless facility definition mandated by the FCC would include something on a 50-foot pole. It could include a small wireless antenna on something taller than 50 feet. And staff feels that it's appropriate and would be consistent with the mandate to still apply the same setbacks that we require of any other structure, including something like a utility box on private property. But that's
Glenn, so that's what you just described. So if there's a 50-foot pole on the setback of a landowner, but yet the landowner has a 35-foot building envelope for their house, so is the 50 just an example, or is a 50 or taller going to be allowed?
Well, the FCC would mandate that we allow small wireless facilities, which include these antennas on top of as much as 50-foot poles, or in some cases taller if there's taller structures nearby, that we treat them the same as we would any other piece of utility infrastructure. And we would require, at least the way that the zoning code is written, that all structures be set back a specified distance from property lines. And we would propose that small wireless facilities meet that same requirement. So the proposal is not to have a 50-foot setback. It's that
No, 50-foot pole right on the setback is what I think you. Right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, or taller. And so, so I guess my concern is, when we have carriers, putting forth verbiage that they would like to see, of course, their bias is for their own self. But when I think about safety to the public, which, the verbiage says that, the small wireless should not be attached to a living item, what's the distance away from the living human? If it's put on the side of a building, a commercial building attached to a building on the 5th floor, side lobe radiation does happen, and cellular does heat up water. So there is an inherent danger to humans.
There's an interesting twist to this FCC mandate. Is it, among other things, prohibits the county from considering the potential health impacts of small wireless facilities in its development of the regulations.
But yet we can take into account plants, the health of a plant.
So Glenn, let me ask you this hypothetical here. I have a commercial building down in Milwaukee, Oregon, and I want to put up one of these 5G towers, or say transmitters or whatever, and I want to put it up on top of my building, and I want to make sure that it's not over 50 feet, and the provider of the service is going to provide me $500 a month just to have it up there. Am I good to go?
You would be good to go if the small wireless facility meets the proposed criteria. And so one of them is, for example, that the components of the small wireless facility match the color of the portions of the building that they're attached to. For some of the pictures that we looked at, the antennas are flush mounted to the side of the building, for example. Now, the amendments would still require a land use application. In this case, a type 1 application that could be processed within the FCC shot clocks, but it would require us to evaluate, is what you are saying as a small wireless facility the device that the FCC defines it as? Is it taller than the height limit, for example? Does it match in color? So we would need to check all of those things, but if your device meets all of those requirements, you would be allowed to put it on your commercial building under this proposal.
Okay.
Which sort of dovetails to the other comment that was submitted by a representative of AT&T who we met with. They had suggested that we modify the requirement that the components of the small wireless facility be of the same color of the portions of the building that they're attached to. They would like us to insert in the regulations unless not technically feasible. Staff has concerns about that for a couple of reasons. One, we don't really have the capacity to assess a service provider's claim that something is feasible or not. In fact, something might be technically feasible, it's just too expensive, or it's not something that the service provider wants to spend money on. It's also not necessarily a clear and objective determination, and we may not be able to make those kinds of subjective determinations in a review process that doesn't allow for an appeal. We don't have time to have a land use process that includes appeals of subjective determinations because of the shot clocks set by the FCC. The FCC requires us to have essentially clear and objective standards for these devices. Service providers have to know in advance what the rules of the game are. And I'm not sure that saying something like, unless not technically feasible, provides that clarity. The comment also said that there's other jurisdictions that have similar language in their code. I can't find any. For example, the city of Oregon City, the city of Lake Oswego, the city of Seattle, Spokane, Bend, they all have language that just flat out requires the device to match the color of the building. And they don't provide any exception for quote unquote, unless not technically feasible. So there's other jurisdictions that are essentially doing the same thing. The city of Salem has essentially the same wording in their code already. Where other jurisdictions are a little bit more flexible is they might say something like a color that is similar to the portion of the building that it's attached to. Staff would have to be the ones in the position to determine whether any particular color of the device is quote unquote similar, and that may be sort of subjective, but maybe it's clear and objective enough.
Are we going to require the building to maintain its color?
That's what I was going to go to, because on what's secure if they change the building color and the carrier says no, we're not changing.
Arguably, the way that this regulation would be was that they would have to change the color of the device. I should say that, as we talked about in the study session, it is almost certainly the case that these small wireless devices are going to be put not on private property, not on buildings for the most part, but in public rights of way on existing utility poles, because the service would be 5G that would, at least in the initial phases of 5G, would be in service to functions along the roadway. All that to say that there may not be a lot of instances where people are putting big units on their buildings. In fact, representatives of the industry that we talked to said, we don't really want to be in the business of having individual contracts with individual property owners to put something on the side of their building. Yeah. So I think when we talked about this in earlier study sessions, we were sort of weighing, well, you know, how much are we concerned about the aesthetics of these devices on the outside of private buildings? What are some regulations that get to what our immediate concerns are, and how much of them are just, how much do we want to make sure that people are given the opportunity to put this technology out there?
Glen, this is Stephen again. So of the pilot cities that have done some 5G, have you reached out to those cities to get a hold of their documents to see what they have?
We looked
at the setback. The setbacks, that does bother me. And also, you know, on the power poles for PGE, you know, there's a telecom space. There's a certain, you know, 5-foot space for all telecom equipment to be. But I'm a little concerned that there could be an addition put on top of a power distribution system that PGE would be like, excuse me, that's our pole. The telecom lives in this foot to this foot range. And so have we spoken with PGE? And
no, we've not. And partly because the proposal would simply, if those PGE devices or any other structure that is pre-existing is in a public right-of-way, these amendments wouldn't address that. That would be addressed separately under the existing county roadway standards. If there is a structure on private property, for example, a PGE structure of some kind on private property, well, the telecoms carrier would need to get the permission of that property owner to put their device on it anyway. So I guess I foresee an opportunity for them to be able to say yes or no. It doesn't mean that the amendments wouldn't mean that the carrier can simply put these devices wherever they want.
Do we have to consider underground utility areas too, where exposed utilities are not allowed?
In what sense?
Like in my particular neighborhood, in an HOA, utilities are all underground. So we don't have any poles that, you know, in the 460 homes, it's all underground.
Is the question, have we considered requiring that small wireless infrastructure be underground?
Well, no, they may be on buildings in this case. You know, you stated the fact that they probably won't be on buildings, but there are areas that I think we may be in that classification where we will have to consider that if they are going on a building, somebody has to take responsibility for the color of that if the building changes or the siding changes or something of that nature.
I don't see how you could put something wireless underground.
No, you couldn't, but I'm saying in some neighborhoods, they don't have poles to put these on because all the utilities are underground. So if they go and put a pole in a neighborhood that requires underground utilities due to their HOA architectural rules, what do? You
don't put it in. I mean,
well, they go
simple
without
as that.
5G.
Well, you know, the 5G is what I understand it's limited to 5 to 10 miles.
Could we circle
Have to
back?
find something to put it on, a house or whatever.
I was just wondering if we could circle back to the question about the easements. I'm not sure I got a clear answer to that. And you know, I understand the need to to locate these on rights of ways, but the easement language that I'm seeing has no qualifier at all. And easements, you know, are created for a wide variety of public purposes. And I'm just struggling with like, what kind of easements does the county have that this could impact? And does this need a little more definition than just blanket whatever easement is available as the county's jurisdiction?
That easement language is taken directly from the FCC mandate, that they say that these types of devices must be allowed in public rights of way and in easements controlled by the local jurisdiction, whatever those might be. So we're essentially just repeating that and saying that, well, in those cases, i.e. outside of private property, the standards are those in the county's roadway standards. What specific examples there are of our county having easements that are not public rights of way, I don't know those off the top of my head. But they would be, whatever they are, would be regulated under the county's roadway standards.
Yeah.
Glenn, do we have any
conservation.
current installations of this in the county?
I've not been told of any, no. But there might be those out there that the county's just not been told of.
Commissioner Pastor.
Okay. I don't know if you know this, the question here, it's probably superfluous to what we're talking about here, but is the county going to get revenue from providing the right-of-way services and putting these facilities up on licensing these facilities for service here in the county?
I wouldn't know the answer to that. That would be up to transportation. I don't, as I read the FCC mandate, see that they could do anything more or anything more excessive than they would treat any other utility in public rights of way. That's the heart of the FCC mandate, is that these devices have to be allowed and you can't have restrictions on them, including fees, siting standards, coloring requirements that essentially make it difficult to deploy them, or any more difficult than any other public utility.
Yeah, I was recently in El Paso, Texas, and they had large towers that were in that particular area, desert zone, that looked like sequoia trees. They had made them look like trees. They stood out like crazy.
Chair Stevens, I only have one more question of Glenn, but it's on a different item. I don't know if we're ready for that.
I actually was going to ask the commission if we'd like to take another 5-minute break. We have a little over 1 more hour before we have to adjourn. And so we want to take a 5-minute break. Why don't we do that now?
Okay.
All righty.
I'm good.
Back here, 8:43. Are there any other government agencies here? Wait, I may not be in the right section here. Okay, excuse me. Are there any representatives of community planning organizations or hamlets here to speak? Each organization will have 10 minutes to testify. Please raise the raise hand feature if you are in the audience and wish to testify on behalf of a CPO or hamlet. Darcy, are there any that are representing any CPOs or hamlets? No. Okay, I'm seeing. Oh,
Yes.
There's one.
I have Suzanne Wolf. I'm not familiar with which CPO or hamlet she is with.
Is she speaking for as a representative of a CPO?
I can allow her to talk and we can find out.
Okay, because it basically will determine the length of time allowed, either 10 minutes or 3. So, and it's just really is, did the board of the CPO ask her to represent them here? So that would basically be the question.
Okay, she is on mute, but she has permission to speak.
Please.
Suzanne, are you there? I can see that you're on. Looks like you've got your mic muted.
Okay.
There we go.
There.
There we go.
Now I think I'm good to go.
Welcome, Suzanne.
Okay, thank you. And good evening to all of you. And thank you for this opportunity to speak. My name is Suzanne Wolf, and I am currently serving as president of HDOG, H-D-O-G, which stands for Historic Downtown Oak Grove. And our mission is to preserve and enhance the historic downtown Oak Grove area. This evening, okay, thank you. This evening, I would like to state on behalf of HDOG, the HDOG board, that we favor the zoning amendment 276, specific to action 3, which would allow the manufacturing of edible or drinkable products retailed on site, particularly in District C2, which includes historic downtown Oak Grove, and also C3, the McLaughlin corridor. This change would be highly beneficial to our community. HDOG, in partnership with the Oak Grove Community Planning Organization, has been advocating for this type of change since 2017. In 2017, our organization had a summer festival, and during this festival, a bulletin board was posted or put up, and a question was posted to the people who were attending the festival. What would you like to see in our downtown area? And out of the 45 responses, this was an informal survey, so it was just 45 responses that we received at that time. 20% had stated that they would like to see small businesses such as breweries and also brew pubs, excuse me, and also bakeries. So given that, the current zoning ordinance does not allow for such businesses, and we would find it to be very beneficial to to increase the business opportunities as well as the employment opportunities in our area. On a personal note, my sister, I am a resident of Oak Grove. I've been a resident since 2014 for 6 years. However, my sister has been a resident for 30 years. And she has noted over those 30 years that there has been little change in the Oak Grove downtown area, meaning that the businesses that come into that area also leave within a matter of a few years. And so we are in need of businesses that can sustain themselves for several years, a long term, and thrive. So with the interest by the community, as well as my sister's observations about how the downtown area has little change, we would definitely like to see the Planning Commission recommend to the BCC that we have the allowance of the manufacturing and the sale of edible and drinkable products. So with that, I thank you for your consideration. And if there's any questions, I'm open to them.
Wonderful, Suzanne. Thank you very much. Commissioners, does anyone have any questions for Suzanne this evening?
Ms. Wolf, this is Michael Wilson. You're interested in expanding the opportunities. Are there any other, with the bakeries and the brew pubs, are there any other interest in manufacturing and other types of things besides these edible and drinkable products?
That's a good question. One that I don't know if I am confident in answering. At the time that this survey was taken, I was not involved. However, I did see some of the other responses, and I noted that there was an interest in a community center, a community park, but I didn't really see any other kind of evidence of a place that, or business that would be that would manufacture and retail edible and drinkable products on site. So that's the best I can do to answer your question at this time.
Very good.
How large of an organization do you represent?
Could you repeat your question, please?
How large of an organization do you represent?
Oh, thank you. Okay. Yes. Our organization is made up of about 34 members, and we are representing the Oak Grove area, which is about 16,000 people.
Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome.
Anyone else? Very good. Suzanne, thank you so much for your testimony this evening. We sincerely appreciate it.
Yes.
Good night. Darcy?
We have Joseph Edge.
Great. Do you want to unmute there, Joseph? You're still, oh, there you go. Welcome, Joseph.
Thank you for offering that suggestion. I'm Joseph Edge. I'm the chair.
Joseph, before you launch, can you just give us your name and address, please?
Oh, my name is Joseph Edge. My address is 14850 Southeast River Forest Drive in the Oak Grove area.
Thank you.
I'm the chair of the Oak Grove Community Council Community Planning Organization. And I just wanted to, I submitted a letter in favor of these amendments, specifically Action 3, and I just wanted to reiterate our support for that. And thank you for all of your discussion tonight. And, ultimately, I think that, there is opportunity to expand the manufactured goods beyond just edible and drinkable products to other kinds of small scale manufacturing uses that are really compatible with a small scale community business district that is, adjacent to residential neighborhoods. And so I think that there's some opportunities there. But, as we really got into this discussion with staff, it seemed like that was from an administrative perspective, that seemed to be the easiest way to delineate what it was that we were asking for. And so, that's certainly open for a discussion, I think, with how we want to, how, the county might want to approach that. But we're really supportive, very strongly supportive of the proposed amendments as they're drafted. And we would appreciate your recommendation to the board to adopt these amendments as proposed by staff. And we'd be really excited to have additional conversations with staff and with the county, and come back and testify before you and before the board, about other opportunities to allow for more investment and reinvestment in our community, and especially our historic community business district. We'd be really excited about that, and the ability to create jobs and create a lively, community atmosphere, where the surrounding neighbors can, really walk or bike along the trolley trail, to reach these businesses and patronize these businesses without, needing to necessarily drive to them and, take up parking and everything. And so we feel like there's some opportunities here to leverage the community assets so that we can really provide, an opportunity for this business district to thrive and restore its health, of its original heyday, and so I really look forward to those discussions and opportunities to, work with the county on that. But as it sits now, we're very supportive of the proposed amendments as drafted, and would like to, request that you recommend their approval by the board. So thank you very much. I'm happy to respond to any questions.
Mr. Eddy, this is Mike Wilson again. How many individuals and businesses do you know that would be taking advantage of this? Obviously, you've talked to a number of people, and they've come to you. So, what are your prospects here of how's this going to work?
I know of two specific. I've actually had personal meetings with two prospective investors of brew pubs in the historic downtown Oak Grove area. And, at the time, the zoning wasn't right, and the prospect of getting the zoning changed in this way seemed so far off that, I think that we lost track of one of the investors, and then the other one is still invested in and holding land in the area. So, so we should have an opportunity for at least one landowner to who has expressed an interest in one of these uses specifically.
So given the current economic situation in the Coravarnis, whatever, Coravita 119 deal, you think that's still a viable situation?
I do. And we really need to think about, we need to put these things in perspective and look at the scale of time. The COVID-19 pandemic may be an issue for up to another year or two. However, this zoning code is, really looking at a horizon of about 20 years. And so, we really have to expect that, although there may be some public health accommodations that come through the form of zoning amendments or development standards over the course of the next few years, as we learn, new things about how to deal with a pandemic situation. I really believe that when you're looking at the scale of 20 years, that these particular changes to the zoning and development ordinance will withstand the test of time.
Okay, and the other question I have is, I asked Ms. Wolf, how many members do you represent?
I don't have actual numbers on the population in the census tracts that make up the Oak Grove CPO, but I believe it's about approximately 20,000. the CPO boundaries don't precisely align with the census districts, and so it's difficult to provide an accurate number.
And you're speaking for them?
I am the chair of the Oak Grove Community Council, and we do strive to represent the interests of all of our members.
Thank you.
Joseph, this is Brian Pasco. I'm not sure if you can see me, but I want to say that we would be remiss not to acknowledge the role that you have played personally and on behalf of the CPO in getting us to where we are tonight. I want to congratulate you and acknowledge that, you know, it was your testimony and continued advocacy that got us to where we are here. And, you know, I agree with you that there's more to be done, but, you know, this is a good step in the right direction. And I just wanted to thank you for all the work that you've done and encourage you to continue advocating for this.
Thank you, Commissioner Pasco. I appreciate that, and I will continue to do so.
Any other commissioner question or comment for Joseph?
Yes, Mr. Edge, this is Gerald Murphy. I was wondering if you have any ideas about parking. If we increase the manufacturing and edibles to increase business, what are we going to do about parking?
That is certainly something that can be handled during the design review process. And actually, you know, the way that the zoning and development ordinance is already drafted, that, you know, when a new use would go in, you know, through design review, they would be looking at the parking standards anyway. So the current parking standards are, you know, required to be enforced. We see that as a challenge because we live in a built out urban area where it's hard to find additional land to put parking spaces. And so, you know, with that constraint and with our really high quality bicycle and pedestrian connections to the trolley trail and to, you know, 3 bus routes in the area, as well as the light rail station, you know, we feel like we have good alternatives that would provide a pathway to, you know, a reduced parking opportunities, certainly in the area of the historic downtown Oak Grove district that we're talking about tonight. There's a church that's nearby that has a very large parking area that is only used on Sundays, and I guess maybe on Wednesday nights, but mostly on Sundays. And that landowner has volunteered to contribute that parking, those parking spaces as a district parking solution, were that to be legalized in the zoning and development ordinance, to make those parking spaces available to businesses in the area that would patronize them during hours when the church was not in service. And so we feel like there are opportunities to explore parking solutions that are outside of the box of the current ZDO that would specifically work out in our area and hopefully could be, you know, discretionally applied at design review time. Whereas in other districts where the rich variety of options is not available, that the existing standards would still apply.
Well, thank you for your input.
Any other
Thank you for that
comments?
question.
Okay. Joseph, thank you very, very much for taking your time and being so patient with us. You have a really nice evening.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. Have a good night yourself.
Thank you. Darcy, do we have another testimony?
I don't see any more hands.
No hands? Oh, darn. It's fun. Okay.
So just to clarify, I might have missed it. Did we call for general testimony or only CPO testimony so far?
I only called, you're right, Jennifer. I only called for CPO, but we sort of eased right in. So
just want to make sure everybody knows it's wide open before we close it.
Okay. Do you want me to read that part, or is there's just no testimony?
There's 3 people. Oh, somebody's got their hand up.
Oh.
I have Karen Mansky.
Tammy, I don't think it's a bad idea to read that section so it's very clear to everyone that they have an opportunity to testify.
I will. I absolutely will. Thank you, Brian. I'll do that after our testimony from Karen. Welcome, Karen. Could you give us your full name and address, please?
Thank you. Karen Mansky. I'm speaking on behalf of AT&T. And my address is Gaston, Oregon.
Very good. Thank you.
I'm I'd like to talk to you about the color of small wireless facilities that you guys have discussed a little bit. The language as proposed is for the side of buildings outside of the right of way, and it says the color should be the same as the color of the building. And the reason why we are recommending inserting except to the extent technically feasible is because some small wireless facilities are not going to be as operable, as efficient if they're painted or if there's a film over them. And what I'd like to say about that is that small wireless facilities right now are, at least for AT&T, are being rolled out for both 4G and 5G technology. And 5G technology operates on different set of radio frequencies than 4G technology. They're shorter wavelengths, and so they're interfered with easily by any obstructions. That would include paint or a film or any shroud over the antennas. And so that's why we've asked for that additional language to be installed or inserted into the code. It's not because we can't meet the requirement or we're going to think it's too expensive. It's that if we're installing 5G technology in those antennas, there may be some limitations on how close those antennas can be colored to match that building based on what the manufacturer does with the antennas. We may not have any control over being able to paint them if there's 5G technology operating from them. And other than that, I'd like to thank you for all the work you've done on the code revisions. And Glen has done a fantastic job working with my coworker, Meredith Paps. And if you have any questions, I'd love to answer them for you.
Yeah, this is Stephen.
All right.
Director Schradel. When it
Last
comes
name
to
right.
vinyl,
Michael, Commissioner Wilson, do you want to ask your question first, please?
Yes, I do. When you talk about the size of these devices, what are you talking about? Are we 2 by 2 feet or what?
Each carrier has a different size for their antenna. We have different manufacturers, and the types of antennas we select are very specific to a location. We have several to choose from, but the small wireless facilities are much smaller than what you would find on a macro site. Those are the towers that are over 50 feet tall that you see in the landscapes. So the small wireless facilities are going to have a lot smaller antennas, but there's really no specific size for them.
Okay, and so the paint that's going to go on them, I know there's some paint that's been designed for allowing electronic transmission through. Are we limited with colors with that or what?
For the 4G technology, no, we can do a lot with the 4G technology. It's the 5G technology that, we're hoping as technology advances that there'll be some kind of films or colorings that the 5G technology can penetrate through. But currently, we're very limited on what that technology can operate through, what kind of barriers that it can penetrate through. And that's why it doesn't cover a very wide area. It covers a very small area compared to a macro cell site. We're looking at 1,000 feet, depending on the topography and trees and buildings in the way, not 5 to 10 miles.
Okay, and so what I'm hearing from you then is that these are relatively small devices, almost inconspicuous from what you would normally see, like a traffic light or anything.
I'd like to say they're inconspicuous, but they're not going to be inconspicuous. You will probably start seeing some around town. A small wireless facility will be located 50 feet or less from the ground. They're not very high up, and so in most cases, we want to locate them in the public right of way because of the areas we're trying to cover. Putting them on the sides of buildings will limit the ability to cover the areas we're trying to cover in most cases.
So what you're primarily looking for is a 360-degree exposure?
Depending on the area we're trying to cover sometimes.
And we're looking at, you said 5,000 feet or less?
That would be a good statement, yes.
Okay. And so in a city environment with a 5G technology, we would be looking at probably one of these devices every 2 blocks?
That's probably a little too close. For the same carrier, we're trying to cover an area that we already have high density in, a lot of use. And we've already covered the area with a macro cell site. And so we're trying to increase the capacity at that point. That's AT&T's model. Other carriers may have different models.
Okay, how about somebody that lives out the rural area like Murph? What are we looking at out there? Are you planning to put it out there too?
Not currently.
Okay.
Thank you, Commissioner Wilson. Any other commissioners, questions, comments?
Yeah, this is Commissioner Stradel. I have a question as far as the color of the antennas. So AT&T, first of all carriers use different frequencies, but AT&T is 850 megahertz, and you use sector antennas, and the sector antennas are covered with a vinyl PVC molding that has thickness already. So that's a white, typically it's a white shell. So why can't the PVC be a colored PVC?
We're talking about a different technology, 4G versus 5G technology. So currently, most of the antennas are operating just 4G technology. Very specific antennas are operating 4G and 5G technology, and some are just 5G technology. It's the 5G technology that we're worried about, the coloring of the antennas. Currently, we don't have a lot of variety, and to color the antennas or to put a film on the antennas could interfere with the operability of the 5G systems.
Okay, so back to 5G's radios get connected to sector antennas, very rarely omnidirectional antennas. Sector antennas for 5G are 65-degree sector antennas, horizontal or vertical dipole. So why can that plastic not be replaced out? AT&T is a very large company. When you order a city,
this isn't a single carrier issue. This is all the carriers are having the same issue with the 5G technology right now. We expect that the technology is going to get better and there will be more options for covering these antennas or coloring them. But currently there's not a lot of option. Now, we're not opposed to coloring the antennas if we can. And if we can get similar to the building, we're going to do our best, but we can't necessarily guarantee it's going to be the exact same color as the building. And so the language we're asking for is that it's kind of twofold. To the extent technically feasible means if it can't be matched, you can't necessarily deny us because the FCC order would not allow that type of language. If you set up some kind of restriction that will, in some cases, treat some carriers different than others or create a barrier to us being able to install altogether, that zoning code or that language would necessarily be contrary to what the FCC order allows a jurisdiction to do. We're asking for the language to give us some flexibility so we can do our best to meet your needs, make the color substantially similar or as similar as possible to the extent technically feasible. All those are options. We just think that the same color is going to create some problems for us and for your code being in compliance with the FCC order.
Karen, this is Brian Pasco. I'll piggyback on that for a second, because I think you're right that the real, I'm reading the language, and the same color essentially means identical color, which is a tall order, I would think, even in 4G, right? And maybe this is a note for Glen more than anything, that, you know, we should explore some language such as, you know, substantial or significant, you know, significantly consistent, or whatever that might be, to provide a little more flexibility there. I agree with your concern around the technical feasibility thing, but it strikes me that same means identical, and that's really restrictive. I concur with that.
Substantially similar.
Something like that makes a lot of sense to me.
And I'd like to see verbiage that's used in other cities that have deployed, and if they have, you know, other cities have added that language. And I agree, you know, the similar, you know, or the same, would be very interpretive. But all sector antennas are covered with hard shell,
right?
Which, to say that they can't be covered is not technically correct.
This is Mike Wilson. I would prefer a terminology that says compatible, and it appears to me that, and correct me if I'm wrong, that we're mandated by FCC to allow this to come in, and we don't have much of an input onto it. And if we said compatible, that would provide some flexibility to what the color is.
Or I'll make another thought that, you know, it could be substantially similar to the extent that it's commercially available, right? So it's not necessarily technically feasible, but can the company actually acquire a substantially similar product? And maybe that gets at the concern that the industry has about whether or not they can actually acquire these colors, and it would provide a little more flexibility there.
We want this to work.
If I can offer ask a question to the speaker, and that is, it sounds like it appears that the other agencies, other cities, surrounding cities, have adopted the similar language or same languages that we're looking to adopt today or proposing to adopt. So how is AT&T and other carriers meeting similar requirements, or more what you're considering to be more restrictive requirements presently that's already been on the books by other agencies?
With regard to some of the other cities that you mentioned, Oregon City and Lake Oswego, AT&T hasn't built any small wireless facilities in Oregon City yet. We're interested in Lake Oswego, but we haven't built any there yet either, because we're trying to work through some of their code restrictions. The language that you're looking at is very specific. It's outside of the right-of-way on buildings. What we're more interested in doing is poles in the right-of-way. And so right now, all the small wireless facilities that I'm aware of in the Oregon City and Lake Oswego areas, that's our main focus, not a building adjacent to a public right-of-way on private property.
Yeah, because I can almost, maybe this is too strong of a statement, but I can see that City of Lake Oswego Development Review Committee would see, you would see significant resistance to putting something up on a building that doesn't go with the look and feel of that building. And so I just can't imagine, if the other cities have already adopted certain standards, how you're planning on meeting those standards, but you're saying that you can't meet those standards for Clackamas County. So I think I'm in agreement with all of the discussions with the commissioners. We want to be flexible and we want to make this work, but to say that, you know, we're being, I don't think we're being overly restrictive. We're trying to meet certain very restrictive standards that were sent by FCC without any of the the agency's responses. And I think that's actually more restrictive than whatever we're trying to do here. So I hope that we can find language that will work for the industry, but I also think it's important for us to adopt a set of rules that's going to work for our community and not necessarily for one or the other. So there is a win-win opportunity or compromise that I think we can find, but I just don't like the language of coming out and, you know, flat out saying that FCC isn't going to allow us to do this. And that may be true, but certainly don't like to hear that from an industry that's going to be working with us.
Commissioner Murph?
Yes, Ms. Mansky, thank you for coming and answering these difficult questions. I was curious about you placing poles, and will these be co-locations for other carriers?
For small wireless facilities, the poles themselves are generally 50 feet or less. The first priority for AT&T is we like to locate on already existing utility poles. We have agreements with PGE and other utilities around Oregon and Washington already in place, so that if we meet their minimum aesthetic standards and standards for their poles, that we can locate them, if we can also get the jurisdiction to give us the permits we need to do it. And so, yeah, I think I lost track of your question. I apologize. Can you say it again?
Oh, well, yeah, I was asking if you would be looking for a majority to be placed on poles, and would these be co-locations that you share with other carriers?
Yeah, so the co-locations are right now are predominantly with other utilities, electric and telephone line utilities. No, in that we would not be building a pole that is a small wireless facility only pole for co-location. We can, and if we're required to, we will. But at this point, most of the carriers don't necessarily want to be on the same pole because, one, they're very short poles, and so they're not provided a lot of opportunity to cover the same area. If there needs to be a separation between AT&T's antennas and Verizon's antennas, for example, that pole may not be tall enough to accommodate both covering the same area with a separation of the antennas. So more likely you would see AT&T building its own pole and Verizon building its own pole. More likely you're going to see each of the carriers working with the utility companies who already have poles in the area to pick a pole that works for them, and their small wireless facilities would be located on those poles, those existing poles.
Okay, thank you.
Karen, this is Brian Pasco one more time. I just want to circle back. I'm curious if you have a reaction to language such as whether the technology is commercially available versus technically feasible, and whether that gets at, my understanding is what you're trying to do is, you know, you're willing to adjust colors if you can actually get the product. And I'm curious if the other language is something that you think would make sense and be workable to you.
I don't think it's a bad start. I think where the technically feasible comes in and why we gravitate to that language is because some of the colors, or just coloring the antennas itself, may not be a viable solution for the technology we're trying to deploy. If our 5G antenna can't be painted, it can't be painted. So commercially available is not necessarily the same thing as technically feasible. And the language we're gravitating towards is right out of the FCC order.
So would you actually be painting your own products? You're going to order these, right? Or they're manufactured by some third party, I would assume. So it's not like you're doing the coloring. It's a matter of whether the substantially similar color is available to you in the first place.
Yeah, that's part of the supply chain I'm not as familiar with, and so I'm sure it would be an AT&T approved vendor that we'd get that from, and there's a lot we can do with our vendors to get the color match and the style match, the aesthetic. We have so many jurisdictions we're working with that have different aesthetic requirements. We have to have vendors that are fairly flexible. And so there's a lot we can do, but then with the 5G technology, there's some things we just can't do.
Right. But it strikes me that this really isn't a conversation about whether it's technically feasible. It's whether your vendors are producing the technology in a color scheme that works, right?
Or can be colored.
Yeah, right.
Yes.
And if it can't be colored, then it's also not technically feasible. Right.
You're correct.
Right. So that's helpful. Thank you.
Right. Sure.
I have a question for the staff. Going back to this thing as being mandated by the FCC, what if a private or commercial organization is okay with the color that AT&T or Verizon or whatever wants to apply to the the device, and that organization or that commercial facility or individual is okay with putting that on his property? What jurisdiction do we have?
The proposed amendments would not make any distinction based on whether the property owner who owns the property where the small wireless facility will be located is okay with the color or not. The proposal would say, regardless of that particular property owner's opinion, the small wireless facility must match the color of whatever portion of the building that it's attached to, presumably for the benefit of other people driving by, people in the neighborhood, etc.
Well, I think that limits the personal, the personal liberty of those individuals.
Well,
Okay.
I was just saying, to be fair, Mike, it's not limiting the individual, it's limiting the company that wants to put a product on that individual's property. The individual could paint their house whatever color they wanted. The company would just have to conform to that under the current proposal.
They could also paint their house the color of the utility. Then it would match.
So I paint my house purple and gold or whatever, and they come in and they say, "Well, we got a purple paint that works with our product, and we're good." Is that right?
Or conversely, they could have a yellow product and pay you to paint your house yellow, right?
So I don't understand what we have a problem here with. I mean, are we trying to tell individuals and companies and facilities, this is what you have to paint your building to be? That goes against my grain here.
Well, I think what's being attempted here is to force the companies to comply with design standards that a community has already set in place, right? So these communities have already decided on particular color schemes or styles of buildings, and the goal is to make sure that if an outside company is coming into that community, that they're adhering to the standards that already exist.
Well, I don't believe my neighbors care what color I paint my house. And I hope they don't. I don't care what the color they paint their house. And now we're trying to restrict what somebody's going to do with their own property.
Chair, if I may just make a couple of points on this, that as we noted before, and maybe Karen with AT&T could clarify, I suspect the primary interests, at least initially, for small wireless facilities on private property might not actually be on buildings themselves. And indeed, if they are on buildings, they're not going to be on individual detached single family homes, because that's not the service that they're putting out there. I think from what I understand, the primary interest of putting these on private property will be in commercial and industrial areas. And small wireless facilities in commercial and industrial areas, they might be inside of a building. To the extent that they're outside, they might be on light poles or benches or something that is on private property. And we've heard from the small wireless or the wireless industry that they would likely use the same small wireless devices for a light pole that's on private property as they would on public property or in a county right-of-way. They wouldn't be having separate vendors providing separate different types of installations. They would just use the same. So I think that it would probably be more likely that they are going to site these devices elsewhere other than on the outside of a building. And there may not just be that much of a need to put these devices on a home in a subdivision, for example. It might be easier for the provider to just contract with the county or with ODOT, one entity, and say, we're going to have all of our devices look like this instead of house by house matching colors or coming up with agreements between individual homeowners.
Glenn, with that context, it really does beg the question of why we're doing this, right?
Exactly.
And it may make, maybe that this provision should only be tied to residential communities, right? Because who cares on the commercial side? We don't regulate colors of commercial buildings, to my knowledge, really anywhere else. And so why would we regulate this, right?
It's a fair question.
I mean, I think it's worth exploring. If to some extent, if we're going to do it, we should at least tie it to residential communities, because that's what we really care about, right?
Potentially.
Are we getting into deliberation? Because I have a lot to add to that, but I don't think that's where we're at in the hearing.
Fair point.
No, I don't think we're quite there yet, but Karen, thank you for your endless patience. Are there any other questions or comments for Karen? That being said, Karen, did you have any final comments?
Just thank you for letting me participate in this.
Yes, absolutely. Very, very welcome. We're very thankful you were here. You answered a lot of our questions and created more. So yay. But anyway, you have a very good evening and we appreciate your time.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you. Okay. So I've noticed that the two other things besides public comments is I've missed things like additional government comments and additional reports. So I need a little guidance. Shall I just stop here and call for any other testimony? Okay, let me just do that.
At this point, there's still two more people in the audience, so let's just see if they're interested in speaking.
Very good. So does any other person wish to speak on this proposal? Each person will have 3 minutes to testify. Please raise the hand feature if you are in the audience and wish to testify. Darcy, are there any other audience who have raised their hand or shown interest in testifying? Okay. All right, let's back up just one small step and talk about correspondence. Have we received any correspondence on this matter other than those items included in the meeting packets or on email? Glenn.
No, the only correspondence is up to Friday evening of last week, and that would be up to Exhibit 10. So if you have all of that correspondence, that's all that's come in.
Right, that's what came in today on email. Thank you, Glenn. All right, so one other final piece that we're kind of skipped over is, are there any other government agencies here to provide technical information relating to this proposal? Do we know of any? Glenn, Jennifer, no. Okay, all right, now we're up to speed. I think at this point, we are still discussing the 24 point proposal. And I believe, Mary, you had some additional comments before we head for deliberation. Am I correct?
I had one clarifying question to ask of Glenn. Hopefully it's a quick one. So Glenn, on the ADUs, this is number 18 on page 8 of the staff report. I just wanted to clarify what you're talking about, what you're proposing is we're just trying to meet the updates in state law by repealing the requirements for parking and owner occupancy on ADUs where they are required to be allowed by the state. Can you clarify where they are required to be allowed by the state?
Yes, good question. Those are all areas inside of an urban growth boundary where detached single-family dwellings are permitted as an outright use. So
Anywhere else we allow them is up to us, but those areas must comply with the state law updates.
correct. And the MRR zone, as well as the HR zone up in the Mount Hood area, are examples of those where we've chosen to allow ADUs but not mandated by the state and are therefore not subject to this off-street parking and owner occupancy rule change.
Thank you. That clarifies.
Great.
Given that we've run off all of the public testimony now, I think we've exhausted that. Is it appropriate now to actually formally close the public comment period and move into discussion, and then we can figure out how we move forward from there?
Let me ask a question on that. I think we're still getting comments on the various 24 parts. Should we close the public testimony before we continue discussion? Or if we close public comments, do we now go into more of a deliberation? I just wanted, because I did have one comment before we launched, but I wasn't sure where it's appropriate.
I think historically we've closed the public comment period and left the record open for people to submit written comments. Is that correct, Jennifer? Which would allow us to move into deliberation.
Yeah, it's up to you. If you can close the public portion period, and then you still can ask staff questions. You can still ask Glen to go do additional research as part of your deliberation and continue this for deliberation decision only at your next meeting. Or you can leave the written record open until your next meeting. That would be another option. And you could just simply close the oral testimony portion and not take more of that at your next meeting.
Okay.
It's entirely up to you.
Tammy, if I might, I would suggest we're very unlikely to reach a decision tonight. So I would be in favor of leaving the written record open. So if the public did want to comment, we could read that in between and consider that before we take a final action at our next meeting.
And I concur unless any other commissioner does not. I think I would like to now close the public testimony portion of the hearing. And I would like to leave the written open, and I would like to continue with our discussion. Good?
Sounds good. Staff, does that work?
I think fine. You could do a motion. We're not
so
always
moved.
that formal, but
I think we have a motion from Commissioner Phillips. Do we have a second?
Second.
Second from
Motion
Commissioner
to what? Motion to what?
To close the public comment section.
But leave the written testimony open for
I agree.
Okay. Any other further discussion? Then all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstain? Motion passes unanimously. Very good.
So for the public watching, to be clear, we're leaving the written testimony open, but we've closed oral comments.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Since we're having this meeting via Zoom and telephone conversation, I would like to ask for a roll call on each motion.
Oh, okay. Darcy, would you care to accommodate that, please? And again, just to make it really clear, this is a motion to close the public comments or testimony, but however, to leave the written portion open.
do you don't have to do this right now, but just sort of throwing this out there, since I think we're all conceding there's not going to be a decision tonight, you might want to just set a date as part of this. You're going to need to leave the written record open to a date certain.
Okay, we're also going to probably want to, after that, have some discussion of what we want staff to look into.
Correct.
So I think we can make that motion, pick a date, and then after we've done that, before 10 o'clock, decide what we want staff to look into. And
Jennifer, can you recommend a date?
Yes, July 13th. That's your
works.
next regularly scheduled meeting, and you don't have anything on the schedule that night. Well, that would be at 6:30. And at this point, we believe it will still be via Zoom. If that changes, we'll certainly let you all know. But for the moment, I think we should make that assumption that we'll post the Zoom link a week in advance as we did for this one.
Okay. Okay, and then Mary, you had mentioned something about getting, directing staff. That's not a part of the motion, correct?
No, that's for us to decide before we close tonight's portion of the hearing.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure we were clear. All right, do we need to then go ahead, if there's no further discussion, to take a roll call on the motion?
Shall I amend the motion to include the date we're going to continue the hearing to so that it's all in one?
That would be helpful, thank you.
Okay, so for the amended motion, I'll move that we close the oral public testimony, but leave the record open and continue the hearing once it's closed tonight to July 13th, 2020.
Very good.
I'll second.
Very good.
At
Okay.
6:30 p.m.
At 6:30 p.m.
Any further discussion? Darcy, would you please call roll?
You want me to just go name by name?
Please.
Okay, Commissioner Peterson,
Yes.
Commissioner Murphy,
Yes.
Commissioner Pack,
Yes.
Commissioner Phillips,
Yes.
Commissioner Pasco,
Yes.
Commissioner Schroedel,
Okay. Yes. Voice is
Commissioner
out.
Wilson,
Yes.
And I'll vote yes.
Stevens, Commissioner Stevens.
Killing me. Okay, so here's my next question. Do we continue discussion on this hearing, or do we move on to the other business minutes, da-da-da-da-da? What's our next move?
I think what we need to do is wrap up what we want staff to look into before the continued meeting, and then try and save a few minutes to do the rest of the commission business.
I concur.
Great, great, thank you both.
I would recommend we take a straw vote on the 4 items that we were talking about, just to get a feel for what the feelings are.
I think that might be better saved for deliberation, since
Yeah.
we don't really
Okay.
have time to talk through them now, but maybe if there are things for those 4 items we want staff to look into, we should bring that up now.
Good.
I would have an interest if we could look into, again, examples of cities like San Diego, who put together a very large wireless document design, and try to understand why that was done. And just for clarifying, the wireless would come back for the July meeting. Is that what I'm hearing? Okay.
Just to be clear, what about you said the city of San Diego's you would like us to look at? What about that would you want us to look into?
Well, so they talk about, colored antennas, or, the facade, being what we don't know, what we haven't really talked about is, there's 3 major carriers. They're saying they don't want to co-locate, and these things are going to be all over the place. And so we're so accustomed to seeing the cell towers that we're accustomed to. And so we need to be kind of having the conversation of the mass deployment of the 3 major carriers deploying all over the county and what that will look like. And big cities like San Diego have already done the research of how it would be put on commercial property, how it would be encased into architectural elements already. And so if other cities have already done the work, and the PDF is downloadable because I already downloaded it, they already have the content in there for us to be looking at.
For what it's worth, I'm looking at San Diego and it says match the color of the surface. So it's worth looking into. I just pulled it up.
This is more just an education process, because, and again, we need to look at just the sheer volume of poles that are going to be throughout the county. And they won't deploy in rural. They'll do the high density because that's where the subscribers are.
And didn't we have pictures of ground mounted or mounted at the ground? that looked just like a traffic box when we were discussing
Yeah.
this earlier.
We had plenty of pictures. They all looked okay.
Anything else we want?
Yeah. If I could add, I just want to go back to the philo stuff really quickly, Glenn. It would be, if we could talk with our transportation department and see if they are willing or might offer some more clarity about how they might propose these funds to be used, and that would be really helpful to our discussion.
Particularly with an equitability
Yeah.
lens.
I would really, if they could give me more direction of that, there's clarity of intent about how they are going to address the equity piece, that would make me feel a lot better. And they've got a little bit of time to kind of think through that.
And if they already have a program, I mean, it sounds like they've already used the money in different projects. If they could just kind of verbalize what the program is about and how they're using it and how it's all set up, I think that would make us feel a little bit more comfortable about how it's getting used.
And why 200 feet?
And why 200 feet?
Very good.
Okay.
So I've been making notes on this, and then I had my other one to add to it, which was,
please,
Glenn, we talked about table 401-1 with the renewable energy and referencing to 401.05 G4 and the language in G4 seeming to preclude renewable energy.
Yep. Thank
So
you.
You can check on that.
Very good.
I was going to add one more. Looks like Commissioner Murphy added on the chat box that he wanted to talk about, or would like, his comment was, I would also like to see vegetated weirs discussed about being included in philo. I don't know what that is about.
Yeah, so being part of a watershed council, we've been working to try and cool off stormwater before it enters waterways. And there have been vegetated weirs installed alongside, or they're gravel bottom and filled with vegetation that absorbs toxins. And this is used instead of culverts, and it's placed between the sidewalk and the curb. And these areas have become extremely efficient on minimizing the amount of stormwater that goes through our culverts and into rivers. This way it's actually going back into the ground. And I would like to see this incorporated, or if there's a chance philo could be used to fund some of these, because most of this has been grant money that's taken a lot of work to get. So I would like to discuss that if possible. And thank you, Carrie, for bringing that up.
Murph, this is Mike Wilson. You got any information on the return on investment for that?
On philo? Or I mean, excuse me, on the vegetated weirs?
Yes.
Yes, there's all kinds of information. Right now, the Sandy River Watershed Council has just signed contracts with Mount Hood Community College to make their parking lots salmon safe. It's the first in the country to have such a listing. And we're putting vegetated weirs throughout the parking lot to catch this water before it goes into Beaver Creek. And we're on the third leg of this right now. And it's all, you know, it's very affordable, and it's awesome how it works. So
can I
I don't have any problem with that, Murph. I certainly don't have any problem with that. I just want to know, you know, what we're going to get for the money that's going to be spent for that.
Okay, yeah. I'll dig up information for you, Mike.
So
all right, thank you.
I'll have it for the next meeting. I'll make sure Glenn has it.
I have a technical process question. Glenn, I don't think you ever finished your presentation to give us your formal recommendation.
Gave you the spoiler alert at the beginning.
Yeah, I guess that technically counts. Do you want to say it really quick so it's on the record?
Yeah, staff's recommendation is to adopt the amendments included in attachment A.
Thanks. Okay.
Thank you.
I have one more thing to add to Glenn's to-do list. We talked about some of the other options for small manufacturing that could be compatible in these commercial areas that aren't necessarily edible or drinkable. Glenn, do you feel like you have enough time to look into what some of that might be? Or do you think that's too big for a continued hearing and it needs to be in another project?
Well, I think that we would need to know what it is that people are proposing to be manufactured, and then we can have a discussion of whether that particular land use would be appropriate. All that we've heard through this process is requests to allow essentially manufacturing of edible or drinkable products. And then along the way, people have asked, well, how come we're not including other things? Well, they just haven't been suggested primarily. And some ideas that we've come up with, for example, the glass blowing, just as we play the exercise game, are already allowed. So what would be helpful is just knowing what types of manufacturing people are thinking that are not edible or drinkable that they would consider wanting to allow. And then we can look at, what might be the land use impacts, what would be the challenges of allowing that type of manufacturing.
So for everyone listening, submit written comments before the continued hearing on the 13th.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Glenn, this is what I would suggest you do. We've had a number of people that came in and talked about this particular item. I would suggest you go back to them and say, look, tell us what you also want to do, and let them come back and not be worried so much about what you got to do. Let them, they're interested in doing this, let them come back and say, here's what we think will happen.
Great. Okay. Anything else we'd like Glenn to achieve before July 13th? Okay,
Staff, do you feel like you've been able to write down our list or get it from the recording?
Right.
Yeah.
Tammy, just to get it out of the way, I would move the approval of the June 8th, 2020 minutes so we can get that.
Thank you. Gosh, that was on my mind. You just read it. Thank you for that motion. And second we have from, who was that? Murph? Oh, great. Thank you, Shortle. And so any further discussion on the minutes? All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed?
Aye.
Great. Opposed? Abstained.
Abstain. Commissioner Phillips abstains. I was not at the meeting.
One abstention.
I was at the meeting.
Two.
And
Commissioner Wilson also.
Okay. 2 abstentions from Commissioner Phillips and Commissioner Wilson. Okay, very good. Any other business with no time to spare? No, nothing. Very good. I don't think we need to review a blank schedule other than July 13th. And the only comment is I really want to figure out how this cannot happen again with Commissioner Lopez. If we can somehow, whether it's technology or something, so that Louise can join us, that is really vital. Yeah. Can you work on that, Darcy and Jennifer? Great. Okay.
We can try. I mean, I don't.
At some point, there's only so much I can do.
Right.
I mean, if
I think the
she
one
was able to join last time, I don't know what the difference was this week. I'm back here resending the invitation. I'm trying to do what I can to get her connected, and it just wasn't working tonight.
I mean, now that the county buildings are open, I wonder if there's an opportunity to set her up with a station or something there, but I know that's a stretch too.
Yeah, I mean, we can look, we can ask. They've been relatively adamant about, the meetings are still going to be Zoom, but it's possible that for one person we could do something. But it's like, well, we've got to provide a laptop and we've got to provide, anyway, we'll have to see what we can do, if anything, but we can.
Okay. And that's all I'm asking is what we can do, if we can do something. I know she's probably as disappointed as we are that she wasn't able to join us. So, okay. If there's no further business, I'd like to adjourn the meeting at 10:02.
Listen, wait a minute before we adjourn. I had a request that we take a straw vote on those 4 significant issues, just so we know where we stand.
I think we're going to delay those until our discussion and then deliberation on July 13th.
You don't think a straw vote would work, would help us in what we're thinking about?
I'd appreciate anyone's input on that.
I think our bylaws actually require us to have adjourned 2 minutes ago, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think we
Okay.
should move on. We'll take it up first thing in July. Good job, Tammy.
Okay,
I'll
well,
pass.
all of you, amazing work. Thank you all. Good
Thank you all
night.
very much. Good seeing you
Thank
all.
you.
Thank you.
Good
Great
night.
job, Glenn.
Have a
Thank
great night,
you.
everybody. Thanks for your
Good
patience.
night. Bye.
Good night.
Bye,
Good night.
Joanne.
Joanne.
Okay.